My son sent me a message demanding I never come to their house again because they wanted peace. I accepted their request quietly, but by the next morning he was pounding on my front door begging for mercy. Before I explain how I dismantled his entire life in less than 24 hours, let me know in the comments where you are watching this from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful child a harsh lesson in reality. I am Aaron, 70 years old, and a man who knows exactly what it costs to build an empire from concrete dust. The screen of my phone cast a harsh blue light across the dark interior of my heavy-duty truck. I sat idling in the visitor parking area, just outside the towering iron gates of the exclusive suburban community where my son lived. On the passenger seat rested a hand-carved wooden train set. I had spent 3 weeks tracking down that specific vintage model for my grandson's 5th birthday. My phone vibrated against the center console. The text message from my son Dion consisted of exactly 2 sentences. He wrote that Megan and he decided I was causing too much stress for their family image. He demanded I not come to their house anymore because they wanted peace. I stared at the glowing letters, letting the absolute finality of his disrespect wash over me. I did not call him back to demand an explanation. I did not type a furious emotional response to defend myself. I reached over, placed my hand on the wooden train set, and smoothly shifted the truck into drive. I pulled away from the gates without looking back. Dion had forgotten the concrete dust and calloused hands that paid for those iron gates. He only knew the luxury I provided. Megan, his white wife, despised my faded denim shirts and my absolute refusal to attend her pretentious country club galas. She viewed me as an uncultured embarrassment, an ugly stain on the pristine, wealthy narrative she projected to her high society friends. They wanted peace. I decided to give them absolute crushing peace. I did not drive back to my modest home in the quiet part of town. I drove directly toward the towering glass and steel structures of the financial district. For the last 5 years, ever since my wife Yvonne passed away from cancer, I had allowed Dion to manage the secondary accounts of my commercial architecture firm. I gave him the title of vice president to stroke his fragile ego. I provided the sprawling 5-bedroom estate they lived in, keeping the deed quietly under my corporate trust to avoid tax complications for them. Yvonne had always been the peacemaker, the warm light that bridged the gap between my rigid discipline and Dion's arrogant entitlement. Her death left only raw tension between us. Without her gentle guidance, Dion mistook my silent observation for foolishness. He believed my generosity was permanent. He assumed the safety net I built would stretch infinitely to catch his every mistake. The engine of my truck roared as I merged onto the highway, the city skyline reflecting in my windshield. I had spent 40 years pouring concrete, negotiating ruthless commercial leases, and building a multi-million-dollar enterprise from nothing. I knew exactly how to dismantle a faulty structure. I walked through the heavy glass doors of my corporate office building. The midnight security guard nodded respectfully as I bypassed the grand lobby and took the private elevator straight to the executive floor. I walked directly into the office of my primary attorney and wealth manager, Mitchell. He was working late reviewing quarterly acquisition reports. I dropped my phone directly onto his mahogany desk. I instructed him to read the latest message from my son. Mitchell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, read the text message, and looked up with a perfectly neutral expression. He asked me what my directive was. I sat in the leather chair opposite him and ordered an immediate, ruthless audit of the secondary accounts Dion managed. Mitchell pulled up the financial ledgers on his large monitor. The numbers painted a picture of absolute financial gluttony. Dion was not just living comfortably. I discovered my son was using corporate funds to pay for Megan's exclusive country club memberships, her private equestrian lessons, and luxury spa retreats. He had charged $30,000 for a summer gala sponsorship just last month. I was treating my company's operating capital like a personal slush fund to appease a woman who viewed me with absolute disgust. The depth of his entitlement was staggering. He was funding his arrogance with my life's work while simultaneously banning me from seeing my only grandson. The anger inside me hardened into cold, calculated steel. I leaned forward and issued a ruthless directive. I ordered Mitchell to freeze every single secondary credit card attached to Dion's name. I commanded him to lock Dion out of the corporate payroll system, sever his access to the expense accounts, and block his digital entry to the firm's mainframe. Mitchell typed rapidly, executing the commands with lethal efficiency. He warned me that the sudden freeze would trigger immediate declines across all active accounts. I told him that was exactly the point. Dion and Megan were currently hosting a massive, high-profile charity gala, at a luxury hotel downtown. It was a vanity project Megan had orchestrated to impress the city's wealthy elite. They were relying entirely on my corporate credit cards to pay the high-end caterers, the event staff, and the venue management by the end of the night. By freezing the accounts, I was cutting the main artery of their social survival. The hotel management would demand their final payment before the valet brought their cars around. The sheer humiliation of a declined card in front of 200 influential socialites would be catastrophic. I watched Mitchell hit the final keystroke, sealing the financial vault. The invisible safety net that kept my son and his arrogant wife suspended in luxury vanished into thin air. I stood up from the leather chair, thanked Mitchell for his precise work, and walked out of the office. I drove home, made myself a simple dinner of grilled chicken and rice, and went to sleep. The house was blissfully quiet. I knew the ensuing chaos would strike my front door by morning. My phone began to vibrate violently against the kitchen counter just past 9 o'clock. The sharp buzzing cut through the quiet solitude of my home. I did not rush to answer it. I picked up the device and looked at the glowing screen. A cascade of automated fraud alerts from my corporate bank flooded the display. The first notification detailed an attempted charge of $45,000 at the Grand Marquis Hotel Catering Division. The status read declined in bold red letters. A second alert followed 1 minute later for the exact same amount. Declined. A third alert registered a desperate attempt to split the payment across 2 different secondary corporate cards. Both declined. Mitchell had executed my directive with flawless precision. I stood in my kitchen and pictured the exact scene unfolding miles away in the grand ballroom. Dion was standing at the front desk in his tailored tuxedo, surrounded by the city's wealthy elite. The hotel manager was undoubtedly handing the plastic card back to him with a tight professional smile, informing him that the corporate funds were completely unavailable. Megan was likely standing right beside him in a designer gown she bought with my money, watching her carefully constructed high society image shatter into pieces. The whispers among her pretentious country club friends would spread instantly. They would smile to her face and mock her absolute financial collapse the moment she turned around. I placed the phone back on the marble counter. I felt no pity for their situation. They had auctioned off my dignity for years to fund this exact arrogant lifestyle. I built my empire pouring concrete and negotiating ruthless contracts. I was simply forcing my son to finally pay his own bill. The phone screen lit up again, transitioning from automated bank alerts to direct incoming calls. I let it ring. The call went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it rang again. I ignored the screen and pulled a heavy cast iron skillet from the bottom cabinet. Dion left 13 aggressive voicemails in the span of 30 minutes. I placed a seasoned chicken breast into the hot oil and tapped the speakerphone icon to play his recorded messages. His voice echoed through my empty kitchen, dripping with panic and arrogant demands. He ordered me to call the bank immediately to fix the embarrassing error. He yelled that the hotel security was threatening to hold them in the lobby until the massive catering invoice was settled. I listened to his frantic demands while I calmly flipped the chickens in the skillet. The searing sound of the hot oil matched the burning reality of his situation. I remembered a bright summer afternoon 30 years ago. I had handed a 7-year-old Dion a crisp $10 bill before a neighborhood festival. I explicitly told him that money had to last the entire day for food and games. He spent every single penny in 5 minutes on a fragile plastic toy that broke before we even reached the park. He cried, demanding more money from my wallet. I refused. I made him sweep the concrete dust from my workshop for an entire week to understand the physical weight of labor. Yvonne had scolded me that evening, claiming my discipline was far too rigid for a young child. I realize now I should have been infinitely harder on him. He had grown into a weak man who still demanded I replace his broken toys. I turned off the speakerphone, plated my dinner, and ate in absolute silence. At exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, heavy pounding rattled the brass hinges of my front door. The strikes were frantic and highly aggressive. I poured a fresh cup of black coffee, walked slowly down the hallway, and pulled the heavy door open. Dion and Megan stood on my porch. They looked completely destroyed. Dion wore the exact same tuxedo from the night before, the expensive fabric deeply wrinkled and smelling of stale alcohol. Megan's elaborate makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and her eyes burned with unrestrained fury. She had completely forgotten her usual refined upper-class composure. Dion pushed his way past me into my entryway, pointing a shaking finger directly at my chest. He screamed that I had intentionally humiliated them in front of the most important venture investors in the city. He claimed the hotel management forced them to leave Megan's luxury vehicle as physical collateral just to escape the lobby without being arrested. I took a slow sip of my coffee, allowing his juvenile temper to burn itself out against my absolute calm. Seeing my total indifference, Dion resorted to the most vicious weapon he possessed. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a cruel hiss. He threatened to ban me from ever seeing my grandson again. He explicitly stated he would erase my existence from the boy's life entirely unless I immediately called the bank and restored their access to my corporate wealth. I thought the threat of isolation would break my resolve. I did not flinch at his pathetic threat. I turned around, walked over to the console table in the hallway, and picked up a thick manila folder Mitchell had couriered to my house at dawn. I walked back and shoved the heavy file directly into Dion's chest. I instructed him to read the midnight forensic audit. The documents detailed exactly how he had diverted $200,000 from the Commercial Development Fund into a private offshore account under Megan's maiden name. Dion looked at the highlighted bank transfers. The color completely drained from his face. The aggressive shouting died instantly in his throat as the reality of federal prison loomed over him. I then pulled a single formally stamped sheet of paper from my pocket and handed it to Megan. I informed her it was a 30-day eviction notice. I revealed that the sprawling 5-bedroom estate they lived in did not actually belong to them. It belonged entirely to my corporate trust, Apex Developments. I was legally terminating their rent-free tenancy effective immediately. Megan stared at the eviction notice, her hands trembling violently. She dropped her designer purse onto the hardwood floor. She turned deathly pale and looked at Dion with wide, terrified eyes. She confessed that Dion had explicitly promised her the house was his early inheritance. Her voice cracked as she admitted they had visited a shadow financier 3 weeks ago. She had officially signed a private, high-interest loan to cover their previous debts, using the corporate estate as direct collateral. The financial trap they built to sustain their arrogance had just snapped shut on their own necks. They were now guilty of corporate embezzlement and massive real estate fraud. I ordered them off my porch with a voice that tolerated absolutely no negotiation. The sheer panic in their eyes was undeniable. Dion tried to reach out and grab my arm, begging for a moment to step inside and explain the situation. I stepped back quickly, warning him that touching me would result in an immediate assault charge and a call to the police. They scrambled down the steps to their luxury SUV and sped away, leaving black tire marks on the pavement. I closed the front door, locked the deadbolt, and immediately dialed Mitchell. I instructed him to find every single piece of paper attached to the estate. I needed to know exactly who Megan had borrowed money from and what specific documents she had used to secure the funds. Mitchell called me back within 45 minutes. His tone carried a rare note of genuine alarm. He had pulled the county property records. Megan did not just sign a standard personal loan agreement. She and Dion had filed a blatantly fraudulent warranty deed transfer. They had meticulously lifted my exact physical signature from an outdated corporate tax return, forged a counterfeit notary stamp, and transferred the title of the estate entirely into Megan's name. They used that forged deed to secure $500,000 from a private lending firm. They had committed grand larceny and federal wire fraud in a single desperate stroke. The gravity of the situation settled heavily over my shoulders. My son had not just embezzled corporate funds to buy expensive wine and fund charity galas. He had stolen my property out from under me to sustain his massive lie. The anger in my chest solidified into cold, calculated strategy. I told Mitchell to forward me the lender's direct contact information and the exact terms of the fraudulent contract. I sat alone at my kitchen table, staring intently at the digital copies of the forged documents Mitchell had emailed to my tablet. The logical business decision was incredibly simple. I needed to call the authorities, report the blatant forgery, and let the justice system crush them both. However, the heavy weight of a decades-old promise stayed my hand and clouded my judgment. 5 years ago, I stood beside a hospital bed holding Yvonne's frail hand as the cancer finally claimed her body. Her breathing had been shallow and labored. In her final moments, she made me swear I would protect Dion from his own worst impulses. She knew his arrogance and unearned entitlement would eventually lead him to disaster. She begged me to be his shield, asking me to remember the little boy who used to fall asleep drawing on my drafting table. I had promised her I would keep him safe no matter what happened. Sending him to federal prison for a $500,000 forgery would utterly destroy his life. He would not survive the brutal, unforgiving reality of a federal cell block. The conflict tore viciously at my conscience. I had to protect my legacy, my innocent employees, and the firm I built from nothing. But I also felt compelled to honor the last words of the only woman I ever truly loved. I decided to handle this severe crisis entirely outside the confines of the law. I would dismantle the immediate threat myself. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct number listed on the loan documents. The lending company was registered under the name Sterling Capital, but I immediately recognized the business address. It belonged to a shadow financier named Victor. He was a man notorious in the commercial district for issuing predatory loans with extortionate interest rates to desperate executives who could not secure traditional banking. Victor answered the phone with a smooth, practiced greeting. I did not introduce myself with polite pleasantries. I informed him that he had just issued a $500,000 loan against a property that belonged exclusively to my corporate trust, Apex Developments. Victor chuckled arrogantly, claiming he possessed a legally binding deed signed by my own hand. I told him the signature was a clumsy forgery and the notary stamp was completely fabricated. I emailed him the original corporate charter, the unbreakable trust documents, and the time-stamped proof of the forgery directly to his private server while we spoke. I advised him to review the attachments carefully. The line went dead silent for a full minute as he read the files. Victor realized he had been played by an amateur. I stated clearly that his collateral was legally null and void. I warned him that if he attempted to lay claim to my estate, my legal team would bury his illicit operation in federal litigation for the next decade. I demanded he release the lien on my property immediately. Victor agreed, his voice tight with suppressed rage. I hung up the phone. I had successfully severed their fraudulent grip on my real estate. My property was completely safe. Victor was not a man who simply wrote off a $500,000 loss. Stripped of his lucrative real estate collateral, the shadow financier instantly redirected his ruthless aggression toward the individuals who had actually scammed him. Dion and Megan had taken his money, and Victor intended to collect it rapidly. 2 hours after my phone call, the situation violently escalated. I was reviewing structural blueprints in my home office when my phone rang. It was the head of security at my corporate building. He sounded breathless and highly panicked. He reported that a black SUV had just bypassed the security checkpoint in the underground parking garage. 3 heavy-set men in tailored suits carrying concealed firearms had marched directly into the executive lobby. They bypassed the receptionist and kicked open the heavy glass doors to Dion's vice presidential office. They were Victor's private debt collectors. They demanded immediate cash repayment for the entire $500,000, plus an exorbitant penalty fee for providing fraudulent collateral. They cornered Dion behind his mahogany desk, giving him exactly 1 hour to produce the funds before they resorted to physical violence. Dion was trapped inside his own office, surrounded by armed enforcers, completely cut off from the corporate accounts he usually relied on to save himself. My son had played a highly dangerous game with actual criminals, and now the absolute terror of his actions was closing in on him. I instructed the security chief to lock down the rest of the building and ensure my employees were kept safely away from the targeted floor. My office doors flew open before corporate security could fully engage the executive lockdown. Dion stumbled into my private suite, his tailored suit torn at the shoulder and his face drenched in a cold sweat. He locked the heavy double doors behind him and leaned against the frosted glass, gasping for air like a hunted animal. The armed collectors from Sterling Capital had given him exactly 1 hour to produce $500,000 in cash. He had used 20 minutes just to sprint across downtown and bypass my lobby security. Dion scrambled across the plush carpet and slammed his hands onto my desk, knocking over a stack of structural blueprints. He begged me to wire the funds immediately. He claimed the men waiting in his office had threatened to break his legs and throw him out of a 4th-story window if he returned empty-handed. I sat perfectly still, observing the absolute pathetic state of the son I had raised. He did not apologize for forging my signature. He did not show remorse for attempting to steal my estate. Instead, the terror in his eyes quickly morphed back into his trademark arrogance. Dion slammed his fist against the mahogany wood and demanded I authorize a corporate payout. He argued that the company possessed millions in liquid assets and that I could easily bury the payment under miscellaneous contracting fees. He wanted me to launder my own clean money to pay off a violent shadow financier. He expected me to sacrifice the spotless integrity of my commercial architecture firm to erase a debt he created through grand larceny and fraud. He stared at me with wild, desperate eyes, waiting for me to open my digital vault and save him just like I always did. I looked at his shaking hands and refused to open the corporate accounts. 40 years ago, when I poured the very first concrete slab for this company, local gang leaders demanded a percentage of my profits for protection. I refused to pay them a single dime. I stood on my active construction sites every night with a steel pipe in my hand, defending my livelihood until they realized I would rather bleed than be extorted. I did not bow to violent criminals then, and I absolutely refused to launder money for them now. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my denim shirt, and delivered my final verdict. I told Dion I would not pay his ransom. I reached across the desk and stripped the silver corporate access badge directly from his suit lapel. I informed him that his tenure as vice president was officially terminated effective immediately. He was no longer authorized to represent my firm, manage my accounts, or enter this building. My security chief entered the office flanked by 2 large guards. I instructed them to escort Dion to the ground floor and throw him out onto the street. Dion screamed that I was handing him a death sentence, thrashing wildly as the guards dragged him backward by his arms. I sat back down and returned to my blueprints. I had built a fortress of integrity, and I would gladly exile my own flesh and blood to keep its walls intact. Dion was violently ejected onto the busy downtown sidewalk, landing hard against the concrete. Stripped of his badge, his corporate authority, and his father's protection, he was entirely defenseless. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and called his wife. He sobbed into the receiver, admitting that I had completely severed him from the company and refused to pay a single cent to the armed collectors. Sitting inside her luxury vehicle, parked blocks away, Megan listened to her husband weep. She felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. The realization was not guilt, but absolute clarity regarding her own survival. She understood that I would never act as their financial savior. As long as I held supreme executive control over the architecture firm and the corporate trust, they would remain locked out of the millions they desperately needed to avoid federal prison and violent retribution. The armed men waiting at Dion's office would eventually hunt them down at the estate, and the eviction clock was ticking rapidly. Megan hung up the phone on her crying husband. She stared at the towering glass facade of my corporate building. She decided that asking for my help was a futile strategy. If I refused to hand over the keys to the kingdom voluntarily, she would simply have to take them by force. Megan determined that the only viable path forward was to legally eradicate my authority entirely. If she could prove I was no longer fit to run the empire I built, she could petition a judge to grant Dion emergency control of the company assets. She wiped the smeared makeup from her face, started her engine, and began orchestrating the destruction of my sanity. Megan drove straight to an upscale steakhouse to execute her mutiny. She bypassed her usual high society friends and arranged an emergency meeting with 2 highly ambitious junior board members from my firm. These were aggressive young executives I had personally reprimanded last quarter for attempting to inflate project budgets to secure larger personal bonuses. They resented my strict oversight and hungered for unrestricted access to the company's massive capital reserves. Megan sat at their private table and proposed a hostile takeover. She outlined a plan to strip me of my status as chief executive officer, promising the junior members lucrative promotions and massive equity shares if they helped install Dion as the new head of the firm. The junior members hesitated, reminding her that the corporate bylaws required undeniable proof of gross negligence or severe medical incompetence to forcefully remove a founding CEO. Megan reached into her designer handbag and produced a sealed medical folder. She slid it across the table with a cold, triumphant smile. She revealed a completely fabricated neurological evaluation bearing the forged signature of a prominent city physician. The fraudulent document stated unequivocally that I was suffering from rapid onset and severe Alzheimer's disease. The fake report claimed I experienced violent hallucinations, severe memory loss, and a total inability to comprehend basic financial logic. Megan instructed the junior executives to call an emergency board meeting under the guise of an urgent real estate acquisition. She planned to ambush me in the boardroom, present the forged medical records to the voting members, and legally seize control of my life's work. They shook hands over expensive whiskey, sealing a pact to tear me down from the inside. I walked into the executive boardroom on the 50th floor for the routine quarterly financial review. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me. I expected to find the usual assembly of senior partners reviewing the latest commercial lease acquisitions. Instead, my recently fired son sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table. Megan sat directly beside him, wearing a sharp-tailored suit that she had undoubtedly purchased with my stolen corporate funds. 2 junior board members, ambitious executives I had personally reprimanded last month for attempting to inflate project budgets, flanked them on either side. The senior partners were completely absent. Megan stood up the exact second I took my seat at the head of the table. She did not bother with pleasantries. She tossed a thick manila folder aggressively across the polished wood. The document slid and stopped right in front of my hands. Megan announced to the room that she was invoking an emergency medical intervention protocol. She claimed the folder contained a comprehensive neurological evaluation from a prominent city physician. She stated loudly that I was suffering from rapid-onset Alzheimer's disease. According to her fabricated narrative, I had been experiencing violent hallucinations and a total inability to comprehend basic financial logic. She looked at the junior members and declared that my recent decision to freeze Dion's accounts was a direct symptom of severe mental decline. She demanded that I step down immediately and surrender full executive control of the architecture firm to Dion. Dion kept his eyes fixed on the tabletop, lacking the courage to even look at the father he was attempting to overthrow. Megan stood tall, radiating absolute confidence. She believed her ambush was flawless. She expected me to react with confused outrage or desperate denials. I remained completely still, observing the trap she thought she had successfully sprung. The two junior board members immediately capitalized on the silence. The first executive, a man named Harris, who had spent the last 2 years hungering for unrestricted access to the company's massive capital reserves, formally moved to vote on my suspension. The second executive seconded the motion without a moment of hesitation. They swiftly conducted a fraudulent vote right in front of me. They unanimously agreed to strip me of my status as chief executive officer and temporarily install Dion as the acting head of the firm. They slid a digital tablet across the table, demanding I surrender my administrative access codes. I looked at the two young men who were throwing away their entire careers for a false promise of power. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to defend my mental capacity to a room full of traitors. I simply folded my hands on the table and allowed them to complete their illicit mutiny. 30 years ago, during the massive downtown revitalization project, a rival contractor attempted to orchestrate a hostile takeover of my initial construction crew. I learned a vital lesson about corporate vulnerability during that brutal legal battle. I deliberately restructured my company bylaws the following year to make a sudden boardroom coup mathematically and legally impossible. A founding chief executive officer could not be removed by a simple majority vote of junior members. The corporate charter required a unanimous consensus from the senior founding partners and an independent evaluation conducted exclusively by a physician appointed by the corporate legal counsel. Megan had completely bypassed the established legal protocol. She relied entirely on the arrogance and greed of two junior executives who had never bothered to read the foundational charter. I sat there quietly and let them celebrate their fake hollow victory for exactly 2 full minutes. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a sharp crack. Mitchell strode into the room carrying a black leather briefcase. A distinguished older gentleman wearing a gray suit followed closely behind him. Mitchell walked directly to my side and dropped the original ironclad corporate charter onto the mahogany table. He introduced the man beside him as Dr. Aris, a board-certified psychiatrist and the only medical professional legally authorized by the corporate trust to evaluate my mental competence. Dr. Aris placed his own recent medical report next to Megan's forged document. The authorized report confirmed my cognitive function was completely flawless and my decision-making capacity remained exceptionally sharp. Mitchell then turned his strict attention to the two junior executives sitting rigidly in their chairs. He explicitly outlined the severe legal consequences of their actions. They had just conspired to execute a fraudulent corporate takeover using a forged medical document to illegally seize control of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Mitchell informed them that their unauthorized vote constituted a direct violation of federal corporate law. Megan lost her confident posture instantly. The color drained from her face as she realized the physician she had bribed to sign the fake evaluation held zero legal authority within the structure of my company. The flawless ambush she had meticulously planned with the junior members collapsed into a massive criminal liability. I had effortlessly dismantled her entire strategy simply by knowing the precise rules of the empire I built. I stood up from my chair and addressed the two junior board members directly. I informed them that their employment was terminated effective immediately and that my legal team would be forwarding their fraudulent voting records to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I turned to Megan and explicitly banned her from stepping foot on any property owned by Apex Developments ever again. I pressed the security button under my desk. 4 armed corporate security guards entered the boardroom within seconds. I instructed the guards to escort the terminated employees, my disgraced son, and his manipulative wife out of the building. The guards moved efficiently, guiding the protesting group toward the exit. Megan screamed furious threats as the guards grabbed her arms. Dayon remained completely silent, keeping his head down as he shuffled toward the hallway. The security team escorted them toward the primary elevators. I stayed behind in the boardroom with Mitchell to review the termination paperwork. I assumed the physical threat to my company had been neutralized. I was critically wrong. 10 minutes later, the head of my information technology department burst into the boardroom. The young man was completely out of breath, his uniform severely disheveled. He reported a catastrophic security breach on the executive floor. While the guards were distracted by Megan's loud, aggressive resistance near the elevators, Dion had quietly slipped away from the escort group for less than 60 seconds. He had ducked into the primary engineering lab and ripped a proprietary hard drive directly from the secure server rack. That specific hard drive contained the exclusive finalized blueprints for the city's upcoming transit center. It was a highly classified project worth $50 million. Dion had just stolen the most valuable physical asset my architecture firm possessed. The lead structural engineer stood before me in the boardroom, his face pale and slick with a nervous sweat. He confirmed my absolute worst fear. The stolen hard drive contained the solitary finalized rendering of the city's upcoming municipal transit center. It was a massive civic infrastructure project that my firm had spent the last 2 years quietly securing through intense negotiations and flawless design pitches. Losing physical control of those proprietary blueprints meant instantly losing a $50 million government contract. If the City Council or the Federal Oversight Committee discovered that our highest level of cybersecurity was completely compromised by a domestic family dispute, they would immediately revoke our security clearance. They would inevitably award the massive contract to the next competitive bidder without a second thought. The resulting fallout would permanently destroy the impeccable professional reputation I had spent 40 years building from concrete up. I could not simply call the police to report a stolen item. Filing an official police report would immediately make the devastating data breach a matter of public record. The local press would relentlessly broadcast the severe vulnerability of my commercial architecture firm, causing immense panic among our current wealthy clients and primary investors. I had to recover the physical hard drive quietly and surgically, without leaving a single trace of corporate instability. I instructed Mitchell and the engineering team to initiate a silent internal communications lockdown. We would treat this not as a public theft, but as an isolated corporate retrieval operation. I needed to locate my disgraced son before he realized the catastrophic financial leverage he currently held in his trembling hands. I moved quickly to the secure terminal in my private office and initiated a trace on the stolen hardware. The external drive was embedded with a hidden geolocation tracker designed specifically for emergency asset recovery. The blinking red dot on the digital map did not point to a desperate pawn shop or a generic black market buyer. The tracking signal stopped moving directly inside the towering glass headquarters of Vanguard Holdings. They were my absolute biggest industry rival in the entire state. The betrayal stung with a bitter and deeply personal venom. 30 years ago, when I was struggling intensely to secure my first major commercial lease, Vanguard Holdings had aggressively orchestrated a shadow campaign to bankrupt my fledgling company. They had ruthlessly undercut my supply lines, bribed local building inspectors to delay my construction permits, and attempted to poach my best workers. I survived their cutthroat tactics only by outworking them, outlasting their capital, and delivering superior structures. Dion knew the bitter history of that brutal corporate warfare perfectly well. I had told him those stories to teach him resilience. Yet he was sitting in their executive lobby right now attempting to sell my most valuable asset to the exact men who had once tried to destroy my livelihood. I was willing to burn his father's entire empire to the ground just to secure a quick payout and save his own skin. I did not drive across town to the Vanguard headquarters to stage a dramatic public confrontation. I simply picked up the heavy phone on my desk and dialed the private secure line of their chief executive officer. He answered with a smug, self-satisfied greeting, clearly aware of the monumental prize my desperate son was currently offering him in his private conference room. I cut through his arrogant attitude immediately. I informed him that the hard drive sitting on his table contained heavily restricted government-classified civic blueprints. I stated clearly that purchasing stolen municipal infrastructure data from a recently terminated employee did not constitute an aggressive business strategy. It constituted federal corporate espionage and actionable treason against the city government. I explained calmly that if he executed the transfer of funds, I would immediately alert the federal authorities and the Department of Homeland Security that Vanguard Holdings was actively trafficking stolen government secrets. The smug confidence completely evaporated from his voice in an instant. He realized instantly that Dion had not offered him a competitive advantage. He had handed him a radioactive federal indictment that could dismantle his entire corporation. The rival executive panicked. He assured me he had not viewed the files or processed any financial transaction. He promised to handle the situation immediately to avoid federal scrutiny. Less than 30 minutes later, a private courier from Vanguard Holdings arrived at my building. The courier bypassed reception and handed the stolen hard drive directly to my security chief. The rival firm had violently rejected Dion's proposal and physically thrown him out of their building. I plugged the drive into my secure terminal. The internal tracking log confirmed the files had never been copied or accessed. The transit center contract remained entirely safe. Dion found himself standing on the hot pavement outside Vanguard Holdings with absolutely nothing to show for his treasonous behavior. He possessed no leverage, no corporate authority, and zero cash to appease his violent creditors. He was a fugitive from my company and a massive financial liability to his own wife. He called Megan from a cheap burner phone, weeping uncontrollably as he confessed that the rival firm had confiscated the hard drive and threatened to call the police on him. Megan listened to his pathetic failure from a dingy motel room on the edge of the city. She realized their entire situation was fundamentally hopeless. The corporate accounts were permanently frozen. Their luxury estate was locked down by my legal team, and the violent shadow financier was actively hunting them to recover his $500,000. She recognized that staying attached to Dion guaranteed a brutal federal prison sentence or something much worse at the hands of the loan shark. Megan decided to sever her marital ties and secure her own survival at any cost. She opened her laptop and accessed a hidden digital portal she had secretly maintained for years. She deliberately targeted the dedicated educational trust fund I had established for my 5-year-old grandson. She coldly initiated a complete liquidation of the child's collegiate assets. She planned to drain the entire $200,000 account wire, the funds to an untraceable offshore bank, and purchase a one-way international flight out of the country before the authorities could find her. She was entirely willing to financially abandon her disgraced husband and steal her own innocent child's future just to buy her absolute freedom. I placed the recovered hard drive into the heavy steel safe behind my desk and spun the combination dial. The transit center blueprints were secure, but my relief lasted exactly 3 minutes. The direct line on my desk began to ring with a sharp, urgent tone. It was Mitchell. His voice lacked its usual measured professional calm. He informed me that the private banking division had just flagged a massive critical alert. Someone had successfully bypassed the standard security protocols on the legacy educational trust fund I established for my grandson. Mitchell stated that a total liquidation request had been submitted through the online banking portal just moments ago. The entire balance of $200,000 was currently pending transfer to an untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The digital footprint confirmed the request originated from a mobile device registered to Megan. I stood up from my desk. The sheer magnitude of her depravity was staggering. Megan realized her husband was facing a federal indictment and their financial house of cards had completely collapsed. Instead of facing the consequences or protecting her family, she chose to burn her final bridge. She was actively robbing her own 5-year-old child. She intended to steal the money meant to secure his future just to buy herself a one-way ticket out of the jurisdiction. Mitchell warned me that international wire transfers of that size usually required a 45-minute clearance window through the Federal Reserve. We had exactly 30 minutes left to intercept the transaction before the money vanished into a Caribbean tax haven forever. I grabbed my keys and sprinted out of the executive suite. I did not wait for the private elevator. I took the concrete stairwell down to the parking garage and threw myself into my truck. I pulled out onto the busy downtown streets and navigated the heavy afternoon traffic with aggressive precision. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. As I drove, my mind flashed back to the day my grandson was born. I remembered holding that fragile life in my arms in the hospital room. I had looked down at him and made a silent vow. My own father had been a sharecropper in the Deep South. He worked from dawn until dusk, until his spine literally gave out, and he died with nothing to his name but medical debt and calloused hands. I spent 40 years inhaling concrete dust and fighting ruthless corporate wars to ensure my bloodline would never start from zero again. I funded that educational trust the very week the boy was born. It was designed to completely break the cycle of generational poverty. Now an entitled, arrogant woman who had never worked a single hard day in her entire life was trying to steal that generational wealth to escape justice. I pushed the accelerator closer to the floor. I absolutely refused to let her finance her cowardice with my grandson's future. I threw my truck into a loading zone outside the main branch of my corporate bank. I bypassed the line of waiting customers and marched directly into the branch manager's office. The manager, a man I had done business with for 15 years, took one look at my face and immediately locked his office door. Mitchell was already on speakerphone with the bank's central fraud department. The transaction was currently sitting in the clearinghouse queue. The fraud agent explained that Megan had utilized her secondary guardian access credentials to initiate the wire. Because she was listed as the boy's legal mother, the automated system recognized the request as legitimate. The agent stated that halting a cleared transfer required a federal injunction or the direct intervention of the founding grantor. I leaned over the manager's desk and provided my social security number, my corporate tax identification, and my verbal authorization password. I ordered the bank to instantly freeze the trust account and abort the outbound wire transfer. The manager typed the override codes into his terminal. We waited in agonizing silence for 60 seconds while the system processed the command. The computer chimed softly. The manager confirmed the transfer was successfully killed. The $200,000 bounced directly back into the secured trust. I did not stop there. I instructed the manager to permanently revoke Megan's secondary access and remove Dion from any advisory roles regarding the account. I transferred the sole legal custodianship of the funds entirely to myself. Megan was officially cut off from her last stolen lifeline. The boy's future was secured. I sat back in the heavy leather chair inside the bank manager's office. The adrenaline slowly faded from my bloodstream, leaving behind a cold and absolute clarity. I processed the sheer magnitude of the crimes my son and his wife had committed in the last 48 hours. Dion had embezzled corporate capital, forged my signature to steal real estate, and attempted to sell classified government blueprints to a rival firm. Megan had lived off stolen money, colluded in the real estate fraud, and just attempted to rob a minor to flee the country. They were drowning in a violent ocean of debt. They were actively hunted by a ruthless shadow financier. They were completely unhinged, desperate, and dangerous. I realized in that quiet office that they were utterly unfit to raise a child. If I left my grandson in their custody for another night, they would undoubtedly use him as a pawn to manipulate the legal system or negotiate a ransom. I picked up my phone and spoke directly to Mitchell. I told my attorney that protecting my corporate assets was no longer my primary concern. I instructed Mitchell to draft an emergency ex parte custody petition immediately. I wanted him to cite their grand larceny, corporate espionage, wire fraud, and the attempted embezzlement of the miners' trust fund. I told him to contact the family court judge and demand an emergency hearing. I was going to strip them of their parental rights and remove the boy from that toxic environment before the sun went down. The final war would not be fought in a boardroom. It would be fought in family court, and I intended to crush them completely. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wide driveway of the corporate estate. Dion stood in the grand foyer surrounded by half-packed designer suitcases. He was frantically trying to salvage whatever valuables he could carry before my 30-day eviction notice expired. A dark sedan pulled up to the front gates. A uniformed process server stepped out and walked briskly up the paved driveway. Dion opened the heavy oak door, fully expecting the shadow financier's armed collectors to finally execute their violent threat. Instead, the server simply handed him a thick stack of legal documents stamped with the official seal of the county family court. Dion ripped open the manila envelope. His tired eyes scanned the bold legal print. It was the emergency ex parte custody petition Mitchell had filed exactly 2 hours earlier on my behalf. The document explicitly cited Dion's pending federal wire fraud indictment, his corporate embezzlement, and the violent extortion threats currently hovering over his head. It officially demanded the immediate and permanent transfer of his 5-year-old son into my sole legal care. Dion dropped the papers onto the polished marble floor. The sheer magnitude of his absolute ruin finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogance. He realized he was not just losing his vice presidential salary, his luxury vehicles, and his stolen mansion. I was losing his only child. He collapsed onto the lower steps of the grand staircase, gripping his hair tightly in his hands. He wept loudly, fully understanding that my legal strike was entirely impenetrable. He had absolutely zero financial resources left to hire a defense attorney to fight me in family court. Megan walked into the foyer and saw her husband sobbing helplessly on the stairs. She snatched the scattered custody petition off the marble floor and read the absolute demands. She did not break down in tears like Dion. She utterly refused to lose gracefully. Megan clearly recognized that surrendering her son meant surrendering her very last piece of leverage against my massive corporate wealth. If she maintained legal custody of the boy, she could eventually demand exorbitant child support payments to fund her eventual escape from the state. She walked directly to the kitchen phone and dialed the local police department. She fabricated a horrific and completely baseless domestic abuse allegation against me. She cried hysterically to the emergency dispatcher, falsely claiming that I had violently attacked her during a recent family gathering. She stated on a recorded line that I was a highly unstable, physically dangerous man who routinely threatened them with a firearm. She deliberately weaponized deeply ingrained societal prejudices to aggressively manipulate the authorities. The local precinct immediately dispatched patrol officers to take her formal written statement. She filed a sworn legal affidavit filled entirely with calculated malicious lies. Her vicious strategy worked exactly as she intended. The family court judge received the urgent police report and immediately halted my emergency custody petition. The judge issued a temporary stay declaring that no child could be placed in my home until Child Protective Services conducted a thorough and highly invasive investigation of my character. Mitchell called me with the infuriating news. He warned me that a state social worker was already en route to my suburban house. Megan had successfully weaponized the legal system to delay my rescue mission. She bought herself precious time, fully expecting the intense investigation to humiliate me and force me to drop the custody battle entirely. I did not panic when the unmarked state vehicle pulled into my driveway less than an hour later. I opened my front door and politely welcomed the social worker inside. She was a stern woman clutching a thick clipboard, clearly expecting to find the chaotic, violent environment Megan had vividly described in her false police report. Instead, she stepped into an atmosphere of absolute unbroken tranquility. My home was immaculately clean. Long before I ever poured a single ounce of commercial concrete or drafted a corporate blueprint, I served 4 grueling years in the military. That strict, rigid discipline never left my blood. My hardwood floors were polished to a mirror shine. My kitchen counters were completely bare and heavily sanitized. The guest bedroom I had diligently prepared for my grandson was perfectly organized, featuring a small desk, freshly washed sheets, and the wooden train set resting neatly on the rug. I offered the social worker a cup of hot coffee and sat quietly across from her at the dining table. I answered every single invasive question with steady, unwavering respect. I calmly provided character references from city councilmen, community leaders, and corporate partners who had known me for over 30 years. I handed her the complete financial records, proving I could provide an exceptionally secure life for the boy. I made it undeniably clear that my home was a fortress of stability. The social worker concluded her rigorous inspection after 2 hours. Her stern demeanor had completely softened. She openly admitted that my household was perfectly suited for a young child and noted that Megan's aggressive claims simply did not align with reality. She promised to submit a highly favorable evaluation to the family court judge by morning. She shook my hand and drove away. I had successfully cleared the immediate hurdle, but the legal war was far from over. Mitchell arrived at my house shortly after the social worker departed. He spread a stack of legal documents across my dining table. He warned me that a favorable social services report did not magically erase a sworn police affidavit. Megan's fabricated assault charge remained an active criminal complaint on file. If we proceeded to the final custody hearing with that violent accusation hanging over my head, a conservative judge might still deny me permanent custody to avoid any potential liability. We needed to completely obliterate Megan's credibility in front of the court. We needed undeniable proof that she committed perjury. Mitchell tapped his pen against the copy of her police statement. He had spent the entire afternoon cross-referencing her official timeline. Megan claimed that I had physically threatened her at my home on the evening of October 14th. Mitchell smiled coldly. He pointed out a glaring, catastrophic inconsistency in her sworn narrative. My firm's corporate expense ledgers showed that Megan had charged a lavish room service bill to my secondary company account on that exact same night. The charge did not originate anywhere near my suburban neighborhood. It originated from an ultra-exclusive luxury hotel located directly in the center of the downtown district. Megan was not at my house on October 14th. She was miles away spending my money, completely destroying her own legal alibi. Mitchell and I sat in my dining room staring at the timeline discrepancy. The room service charge from the downtown hotel was a solid lead, but a credit card receipt alone would not convince a conservative family court judge that a mother was committing perjury to steal a child. We needed undeniable visual proof that Megan was physically miles away from my house on the night of October 14th. Mitchell immediately picked up his phone and called a private investigator he frequently used for high-stakes corporate espionage cases. He instructed the investigator to drop everything and trace Megan's exact movements during that specific 48-hour window. The stakes were incredibly high. If we failed to produce concrete evidence of her lies before the final custody hearing, the false domestic abuse charge would permanently tarnish my record. The court would leave my grandson in the custody of two desperate felons who were currently facing federal indictment and violent extortion threats. I could not allow that boy to become collateral damage in their collapsing empire. I authorized Mitchell to offer the investigator a massive financial bonus for immediate results. We needed to know exactly who Megan was entertaining at that luxury hotel while she claimed I was assaulting her. Time was our absolute biggest enemy. Every day that passed gave Megan another opportunity to manipulate the legal system or attempt another desperate flight out of the country with the child. We had to break her alibi completely and publicly before the judge ruled against me. The investigator required full authorization to bypass standard security hurdles, and I willingly funded the aggressive legal maneuvering required to subpoena those records. I was fighting a war on two fronts, defending my corporate legacy from my son and defending my freedom from his wife. The investigator contacted Mitchell late the following afternoon. He had successfully bypassed the hotel's bureaucratic red tape and retrieved the raw security footage from the VIP floors for the night of October 14th. He drove directly to my house and handed me a secure digital drive. I plugged the drive into my laptop, projecting the high-definition video feed onto my large office monitor. As the black and white time code ticked across the bottom of the screen, my mind flashed back to the last 3 years. I remembered Megan's frequent unexplained weekend absences. She would disappear for days at a time, leaving my grandson with expensive nannies. Dayon always blindly excused these absences as much-needed spa retreats to manage her stress. He willingly paid the exorbitant credit card bills without ever questioning the specific charges or calling to verify her location. I had always suspected her sudden trips were highly suspicious, but I kept my silence to maintain the fragile peace for the sake of the child. Now, as the hotel lobby footage began to play, my suspicions were entirely validated. The video clearly showed Megan walking through the revolving glass doors of the downtown hotel at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. She was wearing an elegant cocktail dress, smiling broadly and carrying a small overnight bag. The timestamp completely obliterated her sworn police affidavit. She was settling into a luxury suite at the exact moment she claimed I was threatening her life in my suburban driveway. The undeniable video evidence proved she had weaponized the justice system to cover her own tracks and derail my custody petition. The investigator instructed me to fast-forward the video to the footage captured outside the third-floor luxury suites. I watched the screen intently. Megan did not enter the expensive suite alone. A tall, sharply dressed man stepped out of the hallway shadows and opened the door for her. He pulled her into a deep, familiar embrace before they disappeared inside the room together. I paused the video and zoomed in on the man's face. I recognized him instantly. It was Victor. I was the exact same ruthless shadow financier who had issued the $500,000 loan against my corporate estate. He was the same man who sent armed collectors to terrorize Dayon in his office. The horrific truth clicked into place. Megan was not just a desperate woman attempting to cover her husband's debts. She had been carrying on a long-term calculated affair with a known criminal predator. She had deliberately steered Dayon toward Victor's illicit lending operation, knowing full well the catastrophic consequences. She had leveraged my forged signature and my corporate estate to secure money from her own violent lover. The sheer sociopathic nature of her betrayal was staggering. I now possessed undeniable, irrefutable proof of her extreme perjury and her calculated infidelity. I had the absolute weapon required to clear my name and permanently strip her of any parental rights. She had handed me the exact key to her complete destruction. Mitchell smiled grimly as he watched the screen. He noted that presenting this specific video to the family court judge would not only grant me immediate sole custody, but it would also trigger a felony perjury charge against Megan. She had dug her own grave and I was holding the shovel. I did not take the footage straight to the police. I wanted to dismantle the last remaining pillar of their toxic alliance. I summoned Dayon to a neutral public coffee shop downtown. He arrived looking broken, paranoid, and completely exhausted from hiding from Victor's armed collectors. He sat across from me, avoiding my gaze. I did not offer any comfort. I opened my laptop, turned the screen toward him, and pressed play on the security footage. I watched my son's reality shatter completely into dust. He stared at the screen as his wife walked into the hotel suite with the exact man who had threatened to throw him out of a fourth-story window. His breathing became ragged and shallow. The illusion of his perfect high society marriage evaporated in an instant. He finally realized that Megan had orchestrated his financial and literal death sentence while sleeping with his executioner. Dion slammed his fists onto the small cafe table. A blind, uncontrollable rage consumed him. He wept with visceral fury, loudly vowing to destroy Megan and expose every single lie she had ever told. He stormed out of the coffee shop, fully intending to confront her at the estate. I closed my laptop and followed at a safe distance. Dion drove frantically to the corporate mansion, but his violent intentions were immediately thwarted. Megan had seen his unhinged approach on the property's security cameras. Anticipating his wrath, she had bolted the heavy front doors, engaged the deadbolts, and manually overridden the electronic garage gates. Dion found himself standing on the front porch, violently pounding his fists against the reinforced glass. Megan had locked him out of their home entirely and barricaded herself safely inside, leaving her husband stranded on the pavement to face his ruin alone. The cold morning dew clung to the windshield of the luxury sedan parked on the street outside the corporate estate. Dion woke up shivering in the driver's seat. He had spent the entire night huddled in his car, completely locked out of the mansion he once claimed as his own. He was entirely broke, functionally homeless, and utterly betrayed by the woman he had sacrificed his own father to appease. The sharp reality of his new existence gnawed at his pride. He checked his pockets, finding only a few crumpled bills and his useless deactivated corporate cards. Driven by a volatile mix of desperation and blinding rage, he stepped out of the vehicle. He marched up the long paved driveway, determined to force his way inside to retrieve his personal belongings and confront the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. He found the front doors heavily deadbolted. He circled around to the back patio, searching for a vulnerability in the heavy glass sliding doors. He picked up a decorative landscaping stone from the garden bed and smashed it repeatedly against the reinforced glass. The thick pane cracked but refused to shatter completely. Dion yelled furiously, pounding his bare fists against the fractured window until his knuckles bled. He demanded Megan open the door and face him. He demanded access to his clothes, his passport, and his remaining cash hidden in the master bedroom. His arrogant demands echoed uselessly across the expansive backyard. Ani had spent 3 years treating me like a disposable peasant in this exact house, and now he was the one reduced to begging outside a locked door like a desperate criminal. I sat quietly in my truck parked 2 blocks away, watching the pathetic scene unfold through a pair of high-powered binoculars. I had anticipated this exact violent escalation the moment I showed him the hotel security footage. Megan did not cower inside the house. She weaponized the legal system once again. She dialed emergency services, claiming a violent intruder was attempting to breach her home. She confidently cited the forged warranty deed, entirely convinced she held the ultimate legal authority over the property. Within 10 minutes, 2 police cruisers swarmed the driveway, their sirens piercing the quiet suburban morning. The officers drew their weapons and ordered Dion to the ground. I watched my son drop to his knees on the manicured lawn, raising his bleeding hands in total surrender. A harsh memory surfaced in my mind as I observed his arrest. 5 years ago, shortly after Yvonne passed away, Dion announced his engagement to Megan. I had pulled him aside in my study and warned him directly. I told him that a marriage constructed entirely on social status and superficial wealth would inevitably collapse into absolute ruin the moment the money ran dry. He had laughed at me, claiming I was just a bitter old man who did not understand modern high society. He ignored my warning, choosing to build his foundation on quicksand. Now he was drowning in it. I put my truck in gear and drove smoothly up to the front gates just as the officers began securing the handcuffs around Dion's wrists. I stepped out of my vehicle with a thick leather folder tucked under my arm. The officers immediately instructed me to step back, warning me that this was an active crime scene. I introduced myself calmly and informed them that the man on the ground was my son, but more importantly, the property they were currently standing on belonged exclusively to my corporation. Megan opened the front door slightly, keeping the heavy chain engaged. She shrieked at the officers to arrest both of us, aggressively waving a copy of her forged warranty deed through the narrow gap. I handed the lead officer the authentic corporate charter, the original, unalterable trust documents, and the certified digital audit proving Megan's deed was a recently fabricated forgery currently under federal investigation. The officer reviewed the documents carefully, noting the irrefutable state seals and the glaring discrepancies in Megan's paperwork. The dynamic of the confrontation shifted instantly. The officer turned away from Dion and approached the front porch. He commanded Megan to disengage the chain and open the door immediately. He informed her that she was currently occupying a commercial property without the legal owner's consent and that any further resistance would result in her immediate arrest for trespassing and obstruction. Megan turned completely pale, realizing her final layer of legal protection had just been obliterated by the actual architect of the estate. She unlatched the chain with shaking hands and stepped back, her arrogant defiance completely shattered. I walked past the police officers and stepped into my own house for the first time in months. The sheer scale of destruction inside the foyer was breathtaking. Megan had not spent the night cowering in fear. She had spent the entire night executing a systematic campaign of spiteful vandalism. The antique mahogany furniture I had painstakingly restored was slashed to ribbons. The custom glass chandeliers were smashed into thousands of jagged pieces across the hardwood floors. She had taken a heavy iron poker to the drywall, leaving gaping holes and exposed wiring throughout the grand hallway. She knew she was going to lose the estate, so she decided to leave me a worthless pile of debris. I surveyed the extensive damage without a single flinch. The financial loss of drywall and fabric meant absolutely nothing to me. I could rebuild a physical structure in my sleep. However, my cold composure cracked the moment I walked into the master bedroom. My eyes immediately darted to the hidden wall safe behind the shredded tapestry. The heavy steel door was swung wide open, the digital keypad completely smashed. I pushed past the wreckage and looked inside the empty metal compartment. The corporate bonds and emergency cash reserves were gone, but that was easily replaceable. What ignited a sudden blinding fury in my chest was the missing velvet box at the bottom. Megan had stolen my late wife's most priceless heirloom. It was a collection of rare vintage jewelry I had given Yvonne on our 20th anniversary. That jewelry was the only tangible piece of her legacy I had left to pass down to my grandson. Megan had crossed the line from corporate theft to profound personal violation. I stood perfectly still in the ruined master bedroom. The shredded tapestry and the smashed digital keypad of my hidden wall safe meant absolutely nothing to me. The missing corporate bonds and emergency cash reserves were completely replaceable assets. I did not care about the financial loss of the money. What ignited a sudden blinding fury in my chest was the stark empty space at the very bottom of the heavy steel compartment. Megan had stolen the dark velvet box containing my late wife's most priceless heirlooms. The collection consisted of rare vintage jewelry I had given Yvonne on our 20th wedding anniversary, including a custom platinum necklace adorned with unblemished estate diamonds. That jewelry was the only tangible piece of her legacy I had left to pass down to my grandson. Megan had crossed a highly dangerous line from corporate theft to profound personal violation. She was a desperate fugitive currently wandering the city with no access to her frozen bank accounts. She needed immediate liquid cash to secure her escape from the looming federal indictments. I knew exactly how a panicked criminal operated under extreme pressure. She would not attempt to sell the pieces at a legitimate auction house because that process required extensive documentation and weeks of waiting. She would take the diamonds to an underground pawnbroker or a shady jeweler who dealt exclusively in untraceable cash transactions. A broker of that nature would instantly pry the stones from their platinum settings and melt the precious metal down to destroy the physical evidence. I had a matter of hours to locate the jewelry before Yvonne's legacy was permanently incinerated into untraceable scrap. I stepped over the debris covering my bedroom floor, pulled my phone from my pocket, and initiated a massive citywide manhunt. I did not call the local police department to file a standard stolen property report. Bureaucracy moves far too slowly to intercept a desperate thief looking for a quick cash payout. Instead, I activated a vast personal network I had spent decades building across the urban sectors of the city. 20 years ago, a devastating Category 4 hurricane ripped through the downtown commercial district, utterly destroying the livelihoods of dozens of small business owners. While the major insurance companies delayed payouts and the city government stalled relief funds, I deployed my private commercial construction crews. I rebuilt the storefronts of local pawnbrokers, independent jewelers, and corner merchants entirely at my own expense. I did not charge them a single dime for the labor, the steel, or the concrete. They owed me immense, unshakable loyalty for saving their businesses from total collapse. I dialed the direct cell phone numbers of the most connected men in the district. I described the specific cut of the vintage diamonds and the unique platinum settings of Yvonne's collection in exact detail. I offered a massive $10,000 cash reward to anyone who could delay the seller and notify me immediately. My network spread the alert across every single cash for gold operation and underground exchange within a 50-mile radius. I climbed back into my truck and waited with the engine running, staring at the shattered windows of my estate. I knew the trap would spring quickly. Megan was incredibly arrogant, but she was completely unfamiliar with the gritty, unforgiving reality of street-level transactions. My phone rang exactly 45 minutes later. The caller ID displayed the name of an older independent jeweler, a man whose shop I had personally reconstructed from the ground up 2 decades prior. The man spoke in a hushed, urgent tone. He reported that a frantic white woman wearing a torn designer dress had just barged into his back room. She was currently demanding a massive cash payout for a vintage platinum diamond necklace. He confirmed the piece perfectly matched the detailed description I had provided earlier. He noted that the woman possessed absolutely zero certificates of authenticity and grew highly aggressive when he requested her legal identification. The jeweler told her he needed to retrieve a large sum of cash from his secondary vault to complete the illicit transaction, effectively locking her inside his secure waiting room. I thanked him and immediately forwarded the exact location to the financial crimes detectives who were already building the corporate embezzlement case against my son. I slammed the truck into gear and sped toward the commercial district. I arrived at the jewelry shop at the exact same moment. 2 unmarked police cruisers swarmed the front entrance. I walked through the reinforced glass doors flanked by the federal detectives. Megan was pacing nervously near the display cases, clutching her designer handbag tightly to her chest. She froze the instant she saw my face. The absolute terror in her eyes was immensely satisfying. The lead detective stepped forward and demanded she open the purse. Megan refused, attempting to shove past him toward the exit. The detective grabbed her arm, easily overpowering her. He confiscated the bag, unzipped the main compartment, and pulled out the dark velvet box. He opened the lid, revealing Yvonne's pristine diamond necklace resting safely inside. Megan had been caught completely red-handed attempting to fence stolen high-value property. The detectives did not hesitate or offer any leniency. They secured heavy steel handcuffs around Megan's wrists and officially placed her under arrest for grand larceny and possession of stolen property. She shrieked wildly as they marched her out of the jewelry shop, hurling venomous insults at me while struggling against the officer's firm grip. I retrieved the velvet box from the detective, ensuring every single diamond was perfectly intact. I secured Yvonne's legacy in my coat pocket and watched the police cruiser drive away toward the central precinct. Megan was processed and thrown into a cold concrete holding cell to await her formal arraignment. She was stripped of her expensive clothes, her stolen mansion, and her high society status. However, a cornered animal is always the most dangerous threat. Sitting on the rigid metal bench of the county jail, Megan realized she was facing a severe prison sentence with absolutely zero financial resources to hire a competent defense attorney. She possessed no leverage over me or her disgraced husband, but she possessed a flawless photographic memory. During the 3 years she lived in my estate, she had frequently spied on Dion while he worked from his home office. She had meticulously memorized the master administrative passwords to my central corporate operating accounts. Megan used her single legally mandated phone call from the holding cell. She did not call a lawyer or a bail bondsman. She dialed the direct unlisted number of the violent shadow financier who had previously threatened to break her husband's legs. He answered the call with menacing irritation. Megan proposed a highly illegal and mutually beneficial transaction. She offered to give the loan shark the master passwords to my corporate mainframe, granting him direct access to drain millions of dollars from my active operating capital. In exchange, she demanded he post her exorbitant cash bail and provide her with an untraceable vehicle to flee the state. The shadow financier gladly accepted the terms, initiating a massive digital assault on my empire. I drove away from the commercial district with the heavy velvet box resting safely inside my coat pocket. The recovery of my late wife's vintage diamond necklace brought a brief moment of profound relief. That comfort evaporated the second my phone began ringing with a frantic emergency override tone. The caller ID displayed the name of my chief information security officer. He did not bother with formal greetings. He loudly reported that the corporate mainframe was currently sustaining a massive and highly aggressive digital assault. Unidentified hackers were bombarding our central servers with a coordinated brute force attack. The chilling reality was that they were not attempting to guess the passwords. They were using exact high-level administrative credentials to bypass the outer firewalls. They were using the specific secondary passcodes that Megan had meticulously memorized while spying on my son inside the estate. Sitting in her holding cell, she had weaponized her photographic memory and sold my security keys to Victor, the shadow financier. Victor had immediately deployed a team of professional hackers to drain my active operating capital. The security chief warned me that the attackers were inches away from breaching the primary financial node. If they cracked the final encryption layer, they would instantly siphon millions of dollars from our project funding payroll reserves and client escrow accounts into untraceable, offshore cryptocurrency wallets. Megan had orchestrated a catastrophic digital heist from behind iron bars to purchase her freedom. I gripped the steering wheel and demanded an immediate status report on our defensive capabilities. The chief stated the hackers were moving too fast to patch the compromised entry points remotely. I pulled my truck violently onto the shoulder of the highway and issued a drastic absolute command. I ordered the security chief to execute a total hardware shutdown. The young executive hesitated, his voice rising in panic. He argued that initiating a hard manual shutdown in the middle of the business day would instantly freeze every active project site across the state, lock our employees out of their workstations, and trigger widespread panic among our primary investors. I overrode his hesitation with a voice that tolerated zero debate. I told him that pausing a construction site costs thousands, but losing the central capital reserves would bankrupt the entire empire by nightfall. 30 years ago, when the architectural industry first began transitioning from drafting tables to digital cloud-based storage, I utterly refused to follow the trend blindly. I prioritized unhackable physical infrastructure over flashy, convenient technology. I spent millions of dollars constructing a subterranean, temperature-controlled server room beneath my headquarters. I explicitly demanded the installation of a physical kill switch that could mechanically sever the servers from the global internet network. My younger executives had mocked the expense, calling it an archaic and paranoid waste of resources. That archaic philosophy was now the only thing standing between my company and absolute financial ruin. I ordered the chief to march down to the basement and pull the lever. I listened through the phone as heavy alarms blared in the background, followed by the heavy, mechanical clunk of the main fiber optic cables detaching. The bleeding stopped instantly. The digital vault slammed shut, locking the hackers outside the gates. I drove straight to the corporate headquarters and bypassed the chaotic lobby, taking the service elevator down to the isolated server room. My cybersecurity team was frantically typing on isolated local terminals, analyzing the digital footprint of the assault. Blocking the hackers was merely a temporary solution. Victor would simply wait for the servers to come back online and strike again. I needed to eradicate the threat permanently. I authorized the creation of a digital honeypot. We isolated a single dummy account on a partitioned server entirely disconnected from the main financial reserves. We seeded the account with $50,000 of heavily tracked bait funds and deliberately left a backdoor wide open using Megan's compromised password. We then reconnected that single isolated server to the external network. The trap was set. The hackers, blinded by the arrogant belief that their assault had weakened our defenses, immediately detected the vulnerable account. They flooded through the digital backdoor and initiated a rapid wire transfer. The exact moment the bait funds moved, my cybersecurity experts triggered a tracking algorithm that locked onto the attackers' data packets. The trace tore aggressively through their encrypted virtual private networks and proxy servers. Within 4 minutes, my team stripped away their digital masks. We pinpointed the exact physical IP address of the hacking operation, mapping it to a nondescript commercial warehouse on the industrial edge of the city. I forwarded the exact coordinates directly to the Federal Cyber Crimes Division. The response from the federal authorities was immediate and overwhelming. Heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by local SWAT units, descended upon the industrial warehouse. They breached the reinforced steel doors with explosive charges swarming the illicit operation. They arrested Victor and his entire team of black market hackers on the spot. The agents seized dozens of encrypted computer towers, illegal server racks, and mountains of stolen financial data. The raid completely neutralized the shadow financier and permanently eliminated the threat to my corporate capital. The digital war was over, but the physical evidence seized inside that warehouse ignited a much larger fire. Later that evening, the lead federal agent contacted Mitchell regarding the items confiscated from Victor's personal safe. They had not only found digital ledgers detailing his extortion racket, they discovered a thick physical folder containing the original fraudulent loan application that Dion and Megan had signed to secure their $500,000. The folder also contained the original forged warranty deed bearing my clumsily replicated signature. The authorities now possessed undeniable physical proof tying my son directly to a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy involving a known organized crime syndicate. Dion was no longer just facing a local civil dispute or an internal corporate embezzlement charge. The discovery placed him squarely in the crosshairs of a major federal indictment. He had desperately tried to outrun his mistakes, but the explosive evidence found in Victor's safe meant the absolute full weight of the United States justice system was now coming for him. The aftermath of the warehouse raid reached my corporate doorstep. before the morning sun fully crested the city skyline. My receptionist buzzed my private office line with a trembling voice. She announced that 2 federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation were waiting in the executive lobby. I instructed her to send them back to my suite immediately. The agents walked through my double mahogany doors, carrying thick manila folders sealed with government tape. They did not sit down. The lead agent bluntly informed me that they had successfully dismantled Victor the shadow financier and his illicit lending operation overnight. During their search of his primary vault, they recovered the original fraudulent loan application alongside the counterfeit warranty deed for my corporate estate. The agent placed a high-resolution photograph of the forged documents directly onto my desk. The fake signature bearing my name was circled in bright red ink. The authorities possessed absolute physical proof, tying my son directly to a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. The agent looked at me dead in the eye and asked a very direct question. He wanted to know if my commercial architecture firm had any official knowledge of the fraudulent transaction, or if Dion acted entirely as a rogue operative. The conflict immediately crystallized in my mind. I had a fleet of ruthless corporate attorneys on retainer who could easily muddy the legal waters. Mitchell could bury the federal prosecutors in injunctions, claim the documents were fabricated by Victor, and shield my son from a crushing prison sentence. I had the financial power to build an impenetrable legal wall around my flesh and blood. I looked at the 2 federal agents waiting for my official statement. I had to decide right then whether to save my son or save the integrity of my life's work. I asked the federal agents to give me exactly 5 minutes alone in my office to consult with my legal counsel. They nodded respectfully and stepped out into the hallway. I did not call Mitchell. I turned my leather chair around and stared at a framed photograph resting on my rear credenza. It was an old picture taken nearly 30 years ago. I was wearing a dust-covered hard hat, holding a 5-year-old Dion in my arms at the groundbreaking ceremony of my very first commercial plaza. I was smiling brightly, wearing a miniature construction vest. I stared at his innocent face and felt a heavy, suffocating wave of profound regret. I realized in the quiet solitude of my office that I was the primary architect of my own current nightmare. Every single time Dion failed a class, wrecked a vehicle, or squandered an opportunity, I simply opened my wallet and paved over the consequences. I never allowed him to feel the sharp sting of failure. I never forced him to sweep the concrete dust of his own poor choices. My lifelong habit of constantly fixing his mistakes had methodically stripped away his moral compass. I had fundamentally crippled his character with unearned luxury. Shielding him from this federal indictment would not save his life. It would simply validate his absolute corruption. Covering up his crimes now would be my ultimate failure as a father. I had to let the collapsing structure fall. I stood up from my desk and opened the heavy mahogany doors. I invited the 2 federal agents back into my private office and directed them to take a seat. I did not summon my corporate defense team. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out the thick leather binder containing the comprehensive midnight forensic audit Mitchell had prepared just days ago. I slid the heavy binder across the polished wood directly into the hands of the lead agent. I informed them that my commercial architecture firm had absolutely zero involvement in the shadow financier's operation. I stated clearly that Dion acted as a completely rogue entity. I provided full, absolute transparency. The audit explicitly detailed every single unauthorized transaction, including the exact timestamps where Dion embezzled $200,000 from the Commercial Development Fund to pay for Megan's offshore accounts. The agents flipped through the meticulously documented pages with visible surprise. They had expected a wealthy executive to deploy highly aggressive defensive tactics to protect his family legacy. Instead, I handed them the exact weapon required to secure a flawless conviction. I looked at the agents and officially formally denounced my son. I explained that hundreds of honest, hardworking employees relied on my company for their survival. I utterly refused to jeopardize their paychecks, their families, and their futures to protect a man who willingly committed grand larceny. I chose to protect the innocent people who actually built this empire with their sweat. I sacrificed my corrupt son to the brutal machinery of the federal justice system without a single ounce of hesitation. The agents thanked me for my profound cooperation and walked out of the building with all the evidence they needed. The federal justice system moves with terrifying speed when handed an airtight case. Less than 3 hours after the agents left my office, a grand jury officially handed down a sealed indictment for Dion. However, a sympathetic clerk inside the district attorney's office recognized Dion's name from his lavish charity galas. The corrupt clerk illegally tipped off Dion via a burner phone, warning him that an arrest warrant was actively being processed. Dion received the frantic phone call while sitting on a park bench, completely locked out of his stolen mansion and entirely cut off from his frozen bank accounts. The absolute terror of a lengthy federal prison sentence shattered his remaining sanity. He knew he lacked the financial resources to hire a defense attorney, and he knew I had completely abandoned him to the wolves. Driven by blind animal panic, Dion resorted to another felony. He sprinted 8 blocks to one of my active commercial construction sites downtown. He used his old memorized security codes to bypass the secondary gate lock. He spotted a heavy-duty company utility vehicle idling near the foreman's trailer, with the keys still in the ignition. Dion threw open the driver's side door, shoved the truck into gear, and sped recklessly off the active job site. He smashed through a temporary chain-link fence and merged violently onto the southbound interstate. I was terrified of spending decades in a concrete cell. He decided to flee across the state border to evade the incoming federal marshals. He believed stealing my company vehicle would provide the perfect anonymous getaway. He thought he could simply outrun a federal manhunt on the open highway. He was making the most dangerous and catastrophic mistake of his entire life. The chief logistics officer of my firm burst into my private office without knocking. He reported a critical security breach at the downtown commercial site. A heavy-duty corporate utility vehicle had just been ripped from the secure lot. The digital GPS transponder showed the massive SUV tearing through the city limits and merging recklessly onto the southbound interstate, heading straight toward the state border. Dion was driving. I was running from the sealed federal indictment in a blind panic. The logistics officer urged me to call the highway patrol immediately to report the grand theft auto. I refused his request and ordered him to lock the door and leave my office. Calling the state troopers would instantly trigger a high-speed pursuit across multiple counties. Dion was operating a 3-ton piece of commercial machinery in a state of absolute terror. A coordinated police chase would inevitably end in a catastrophic collision on the highway. That outcome would likely kill innocent civilians and guarantee my son would leave the interstate inside a body bag. I had handed Dion over to the justice system to face his financial crimes, but I utterly refused to sign his physical death warrant by provoking a violent manhunt. If the federal agents realized he was fleeing their jurisdiction, they would deploy helicopters and spike strips to forcibly stop him. I needed to halt his frantic escape without alerting the authorities to his exact location until the vehicle was securely immobilized. I transferred the real-time tracking grid directly to my desktop monitor. I had to execute a precise mechanical intervention before he crossed the border. I opened the secure fleet management portal on my terminal and locked onto the blinking red icon moving rapidly down the interstate map. I pulled up the primary control interface for the stolen vehicle. 15 years ago, during a rapid expansion phase of my commercial architecture firm, a young site foreman stole a company truck after a bitter domestic dispute. He sped down a wet highway, lost control of the wheel, and wrapped the heavy vehicle around a concrete bridge pillar. I paid for his funeral and sat in the church with his grieving mother. That horrific tragedy permanently altered my approach to corporate logistics. I ordered my engineering team to install military-grade remote override limiters in every single piece of heavy machinery and utility vehicle my company owned. My younger executives argued the installation costs were an absurd and paranoid waste of capital. I ignored them entirely. I valued human life far more than steel and profit margins. That expensive safety measure was now the exact tool I needed to keep my own son alive. I watched the digital speedometer on my screen register 90 miles per hour. I could not simply kill the engine while he was weaving recklessly through heavy civilian traffic. Cutting the power at that extreme velocity would instantly lock the steering column and cause the massive truck to flip violently across the lanes. I had to monitor his exact movements and wait for the absolute perfect tactical moment to drop the electronic hammer. I sat perfectly still watching the GPS beacon approach the state line, waiting for his intense panic to require a physical pause. The blinking red dot on my monitor finally slowed down, just 3 miles shy of the state border crossing. The relentless digital readout dropped from 90 miles per hour to 0. Dion had pulled the stolen utility vehicle off the interstate and parked at a rural commercial gas station to refuel his escape. He had given me the exact operational window I required. I typed the administrative override codes into my secure terminal and hit the execution key. The command transmitted instantly through the satellite network. The remote limiter severed the fuel line connection and permanently locked the electronic ignition matrix of the SUV. The engine died completely. I watched the diagnostic screen confirm the total vehicle shutdown. Dion was now completely stranded on a patch of oil-stained concrete in the middle of nowhere. He could turn the key 1,000 times, but the engine would never spark again. I successfully neutralized his desperate flight without triggering a violent highway pursuit or endangering a single innocent driver. He was grounded, safely stripped of his momentum and entirely out of options. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct number for the federal agent leading the embezzlement case. I provided the exact coordinates of the gas station and informed him that the fugitive was waiting there quietly for pickup. The agent thanked me for the precise intelligence and dispatched state units immediately to secure the perimeter. State troopers and federal marshals swarmed the rural gas station 20 minutes later. They found Dion sitting helplessly behind the steering wheel of the dead corporate vehicle, weeping as the heavily armed officers drew their weapons and ordered him onto the pavement. He was hauled into a secure federal holding facility in the neighboring county. Mitchell called me late that evening with the official arraignment details. The profound relief of keeping my son physically alive was instantly obliterated by Mitchell's urgent tone. Facing multiple decades in federal prison for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and attempting to flee a federal indictment, Dion had completely panicked. Sitting in the cold interrogation room, he demanded to speak with the lead federal prosecutor to negotiate an emergency plea agreement. Dion offered to trade a massive corporate target in exchange for complete legal immunity. High gave a sworn recorded statement falsely testifying that I was the actual mastermind behind the entire $200,000 embezzlement scheme. He lied directly to the federal agents, claiming I specifically ordered him to siphon the funds into offshore accounts to deliberately evade millions of dollars in corporate taxes. Dion accused me of using him as an expendable pawn to hide decades of systemic financial corruption within my commercial architecture firm. I was entirely willing to send his own father to federal prison just to save himself from the consequences of his arrogance. Mitchell warned me that the ambitious federal prosecutor took the bait. The Department of Justice was immediately suspending my corporate operations and launching a full-scale federal tax evasion probe into my life's work. Dion had handed them a poisoned plea deal, placing my entire empire squarely in the crosshairs of the federal government. Mitchell arrived at my suburban home before sunrise the next morning. He did not bother knocking. He used his emergency key and walked directly into my kitchen with a thick briefcase clutched in his hand. His face was entirely devoid of its usual professional calm. He informed me that the federal prosecutor had officially weaponized my son's desperate perjury. The Department of Justice had frozen my primary commercial operating accounts and drafted subpoenas for every single financial record my architecture firm had generated over the last decade. Dion had sat in a federal interrogation room and crafted a highly detailed, entirely fabricated narrative. He claimed that the $200,000 he stole was actually a carefully disguised tax evasion maneuver that I had personally ordered him to execute. I told the federal agents that I routinely used him as a corporate shield to funnel massive commercial development profits into untraceable, offshore accounts under Megan's maiden name. Dion was attempting to trade my freedom for his own. He was willing to watch me die in a federal penitentiary to avoid facing the consequences of his arrogance. If the federal government believed his vicious lie, they would completely dismantle my company, seize my assets, and potentially indict me for systemic corporate fraud. Mitchell warned me that federal tax evasion probes destroy reputations instantly, regardless of the final verdict. The mere existence of the investigation would cause my major civic clients to cancel their contracts. My own son had placed a loaded gun directly against the temple of my legacy. I poured Mitchell a cup of black coffee and sat down at my kitchen table. I did not experience a single ounce of panic. I knew exactly how to dismantle a false accusation. I instructed Mitchells to follow me down to the finished basement of my home. I walked past the modern media center and unlocked a heavy steel fireproof door leading into my private, climate-controlled archive. Mitchell stood in the doorway, completely stunned by the sheer volume of perfectly organized filing cabinets. For 40 years, I had navigated an industry notorious for shady handshake deals and sudden bankruptcies. I learned very early in my career that digital promises can be easily manipulated or erased by a clever hacker. I never trusted my corporate survival entirely to a computer server. Starting in 1985, when I poured the foundation for my very first commercial plaza, I began keeping immaculate handwritten ledgers. I recorded every single invoice, every concrete purchase, and every hourly wage in hardbound leather books. I required dual physical signatures for every massive capital expenditure. I pulled the specific ledgers covering the last 5 years from the steel shelves and placed them onto a reading table. These books contain the absolute unbroken mathematical truth of my commercial architecture firm. There was not a single missing penny or unaccounted dollar in the entire 4-decade history of my operation. I told Mitchell to pack the specific volumes detailing Dion's department into his briefcase. We did not need to hire expensive forensic accountants to untangle a digital mess. I was going to hand the federal government the physical weight of my integrity. Mitchell and I drove directly to the federal courthouse and requested an immediate audience with the lead prosecutor handling the embezzlement case. The prosecutor entered the conference room with a deeply skeptical expression, fully expecting a wealthy executive to offer a convoluted legal settlement. I did not bring a team of aggressive corporate defense attorneys. I simply placed the heavy leather ledgers directly onto the center of his conference table. I instructed the prosecutor to examine the immaculate handwritten records detailing the precise flow of every single dollar my company had generated. I then handed him a secondary folder compiled by my cybersecurity team. This folder contained the raw, unredacted metadata of Dion's private email chains. The emails explicitly showed Dion and Megan orchestrating the theft entirely on their own to purchase luxury international real estate. The timestamps on their digital conversations perfectly aligned with the exact moments the money was illegally siphoned from the Commercial Development Fund. The prosecutor spent exactly 45 minutes cross-referencing my flawless physical ledgers against my son's desperate digital footprint. The absolute mathematical perfection of my 40-year career instantly crushed the pathetic lie of a terrified criminal. The prosecutor closed the leather book and looked at me with profound professional respect. He recognized immediately that Dion had fabricated the entire tax evasion narrative in a pathetic attempt to secure immunity. The prosecutor formally apologized for the disruption and officially dropped the federal probe against my company on the spot. My corporate accounts were immediately unfrozen. The integrity of my commercial empire remained completely untarnished. I had successfully defended my life's work without compromising a single moral principle. The consequences of the failed plea deal rebounded onto my son with absolute devastation. The federal prosecutor immediately contacted Dion's public defender and added a severe felony perjury charge to his rapidly growing indictment list. Dion had attempted to manipulate the Department of Justice, effectively sealing his fate inside a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. His sinking ship was now pulling everyone attached to him violently underwater. Megan was currently out on a heavily monitored cash bail from her previous grand larceny and forgery arrests. Sitting in a cheap motel room, she received the catastrophic news regarding her husband's failed perjury attempt. She realized instantly that Dion possessed absolutely zero leverage and would undoubtedly testify against her to reduce his own massive sentence. She knew her fragile legal defense was entirely doomed. Driven by pure, unadulterated panic, Megan decided to execute one final desperate maneuver to secure her escape. She weaponized the brief existence of the now-dismissed federal tax evasion probe against me. Megan contacted her sleazy family court attorney and filed an emergency ex parte motion to permanently relocate my 5-year-old grandson out of the state. She submitted a highly fabricated legal affidavit claiming my household was the active target of a massive federal criminal investigation. She argued that remaining in my custody placed the child in extreme psychological danger. She demanded the family court judge grant her immediate temporary custody so she could flee the jurisdiction under the guise of protecting the boy. Megan was making one last vicious attempt to steal my grandson and vanish across state lines before her own federal trial commenced. She was entirely willing to destroy a child's stability just to secure a bargaining chip for her own survival. The battle for my grandson's future had just escalated into a desperate race against the clock. I sat at the defendant's table inside the austere family court chamber, watching a masterclass in manipulation unfold. Megan sat at the plaintiff's table, dabbing her eyes with a perfectly folded tissue. She had abandoned her usual designer wardrobe for a modest gray dress, deliberately crafting the image of a terrified and defenseless mother. The family court judge leaned forward, his expression softening with clear sympathy, as Megan spun her fabricated narrative. She claimed that my household was a violent and unstable environment, currently targeted by a massive federal criminal investigation due to my supposed corporate corruption. She swore under oath that I routinely intimidated her, and that my aggressive corporate retaliation against her husband had severely traumatized her 5-year-old son. She begged the judge to grant her immediate temporary custody and authorize her relocation to another state, arguing that physical distance from my supposed tyranny was the only way to keep the boy safe from my influence. Her performance was absolutely flawless. She weaponized every societal assumption available, playing the part of a vulnerable woman fleeing a ruthless and vindictive patriarch. The judge nodded along, taking careful notes, clearly swayed by her calculated tears. He looked over his spectacles at me, his gaze laced with preemptive judgment. Megan was inches away from securing the legal permission she needed to steal my grandson and vanish across state lines before her federal trial commenced. She glanced at me and offered a micro-expression of arrogant triumph, fully believing her emotional extortion had neutralized my legal defense. I listened to every single one of her malicious lies in absolute and unbroken silence. I did not object to her absurd claims. I did not scoff or shake my head in protest to the judge. My attorney Mitchell sat rigidly beside me, his hands resting calmly over a thick leather binder containing our counter-evidence. Decades ago, during the turbulent civil rights protests of our youth, my late wife Yvonne and I marched through the hostile streets of our city. Angry crowds hurled venomous insults and physical threats at us, desperate to provoke a violent reaction to justify our immediate arrest. Yvonne never flinched. She walked with a quiet and impenetrable dignity, keeping her head held high while the chaos raged around her. She taught me that true power does not require shouting and that reacting to a predator's provocation only surrenders your inherent authority. I channeled her profound grace in that courtroom. I refused to give the judge the angry and defensive reaction Megan was actively trying to bait out of me. I let her exhaust her theatrical performance entirely. I let her build her entire legal strategy on a foundation of absolute perjury. When she finally concluded her tearful plea and took her seat, the judge turned his attention to my table. He asked if we had a formal response to these severe allegations. I simply nodded to Mitchell, giving him the silent authorization to unleash the structural collapse of Megan's entire existence. Mitchell stood up and approached the judge's bench. He did not offer emotional counter-arguments or plead for understanding. He delivered hard and undeniable evidence. He handed the judge the certified hotel security footage, proving Megan was carrying on an illicit affair with a known shadow financier at the exact moment she claimed I was assaulting her in my driveway. He submitted the official police report confirming her arrest for grand larceny regarding the theft of my late wife's vintage diamond necklace. He then presented the digital forensic logs proving Megan had actively attempted to liquidate her own son's $200,000 educational trust to fund a solo escape to a Caribbean tax haven. Mitchell laid out the timeline with lethal precision. He demonstrated that Megan was not a terrified mother protecting her child, but a desperate federal criminal attempting to kidnap a minor to use as a hostage and a financial bargaining chip. The sympathy on the judge's face evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold and searing disgust. He stared at the security footage, then looked down at the banking log showing her attempt to rob a 5-year-old boy. The judge slammed his gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. He explicitly declared Megan an immediate threat to the physical and financial safety of the child. He permanently revoked her parental rights on the spot and granted me full and irrevocable legal custody of my grandson. He ordered Megan to surrender any remaining access to the child and warned her that attempting to contact him would violate a newly issued federal restraining order. The legal war for my bloodline was completely over. Megan stood frozen at the plaintiff's table. The arrogant triumph had completely vanished from her eyes, replaced by the hollow stare of total devastation. She had played her absolute final card and lost everything. She walked out of the courtroom entirely alone. Her husband was locked in a federal holding cell awaiting trial for wire fraud. Her wealthy socialite friends had blocked her phone number the moment her corporate embezzlement went public. Her illicit lover, the shadow financier, was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary awaiting racketeering charges. She was completely destitute, legally homeless, and facing her own impending federal indictments for conspiracy and grand larceny. She had no money to rent a motel room and no family willing to take her in. Driven by the sheer unhinged spite of a cornered animal, Megan refused to simply walk away into the shadows. She decided to execute one last act of vicious defiance. She bypassed the city transit station and walked miles to the affluent suburban neighborhood where my corporate estate was located. She knew my security teams had changed the locks, but she also knew the perimeter weaknesses she had exploited during her 3 years living there. Megan grabbed a heavy landscaping brick from the garden bed and violently smashed through the reinforced glass of the rear patio door. She crawled through the jagged shards bleeding onto the pristine hardwood floors and marched directly up the grand staircase. She barricaded herself inside the sprawling master bedroom, dragging heavy antique dressers against the doorway. She was a squatter refusing to surrender her stolen luxury, forcing a final physical confrontation over the property I owned. My phone rang just as I pulled into my driveway with my grandson safely asleep in the back seat. It was the head of my private security detail monitoring the corporate estate. He delivered the news with a tense, clipped tone. Megan had not accepted her defeat at the courthouse. Driven by the sheer unhinged spite of a cornered animal, she bypassed the city transit station and walked miles to the affluent suburban neighborhood. She knew my security teams had changed the locks. She also knew the perimeter weaknesses she had exploited during her 3 years living there. The security chief reported that she had grabbed a heavy landscaping brick from the garden bed and violently smashed through the reinforced glass of the rear patio door. She crawled through the jagged shards, bleeding onto the pristine hardwood floors, and marched directly up the grand staircase. She had barricaded herself inside the sprawling master bedroom, dragging heavy antique dressers against the doorway. She was officially a squatter, refusing to surrender her stolen luxury, forcing a final physical confrontation over the property I owned. The security chief asked for authorization to breach the bedroom door with his armed team. I denied his request immediately. Cornered, desperate people holding empty wine bottles or shards of glass make highly unpredictable, lethal choices. Sending armed men into a confined space with an erratic, destitute woman would inevitably result in a violent physical altercation. A bloody struggle inside my property would generate a massive media spectacle, precisely the kind of chaotic leverage Megan craved to portray herself as a victim. I instructed the chief to secure the outer perimeter and call the local police to wait at the front gate. I told him I would handle the extraction myself. I left my grandson safely at home under the watchful eye of a trusted nanny and drove back to the estate alone. The night air was sharp and cold. I pulled through the front gates and parked my truck behind the flashing lights of 2 local police cruisers. The officers and my private security team stood on the manicured lawn waiting for my signal to move in. I stepped out of the vehicle and ordered everyone to remain completely outside the house. I explicitly forbade them from entering the foyer. I did not want sirens or shouting. I walked through the shattered glass of the rear patio door, my heavy boots crunching over the destruction Megan had caused. The house was entirely dark and eerily silent. I walked up the grand curving staircase toward the master suite. Megan believed she had created an impenetrable fortress by shoving hundreds of pounds of solid mahogany furniture against the inside of the double doors. She severely underestimated the man who literally drafted the blueprints for those walls. When I oversaw the initial construction of this estate 20 years ago, the contractor installed the heavy oak doors of the master suite backward. The heavy steel hinge pins faced the exterior hallway rather than the interior of the bedroom. It was a glaring architectural design flaw I had noticed immediately. I always meant to dispatch a crew to flip the frames and correct the error, but the demands of my growing commercial empire constantly pushed the minor residential task down my priority list. That overlooked mistake now provided the perfect tactical advantage. Megan was guarding a locked handle, entirely oblivious to the exposed structural weakness right outside her fortified room. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a heavy steel flathead screwdriver. I wedged the flat edge of the screwdriver beneath the top cap of the highest steel hinge. I struck the handle firmly with the palm of my hand, driving the heavy pin upward and completely out of its casing. I repeated this silent, methodical process on the middle and bottom hinges. The heavy oak door was now entirely disconnected from the door frame. I pressed my shoulder against the thick wood and pushed inward. The door simply detached and leaned heavily against the barricade of antique dressers, creating a wide enough gap for me to step directly into the room. Megan sat on the floor in the far dark corner of the master suite, shivering violently in the cold night air. She was clutching an empty wine bottle to her chest like a weapon, her designer dress stained with dried blood from the shattered patio glass. She looked up, her eyes wide with absolute shock as I stepped through her impenetrable barricade without making a single sound. The fight instantly drained completely out of her. She dropped the glass bottle onto the plush carpet. It rolled harmlessly against my heavy work boot. I did not raise my voice or offer any cruel remarks. I simply extended my hand, pulled her up from the floor, and calmly escorted her down the grand staircase. I walked her out the front door without a single drop of violence, handing her directly over to the waiting police officers for criminal trespassing. I stood alone on the front porch and watched the police cruiser carry Megan away into the dark. The flashing red and blue lights disappeared around the bend of the affluent suburban street, leaving behind a profound and heavy silence. I turned around and walked back inside the sprawling estate. I surveyed the extensive damage she had inflicted during her final hours of desperate panic. The shattered chandeliers, the ripped drywall, and the slashed antique furniture were completely irrelevant to my financial standing. I could hire a premium contracting crew in the morning to repair every physical flaw by the end of the month. Yet as I walked through the expansive echoing hallways, I felt a deep suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. This house was no longer a valuable commercial asset or a symbol of my architectural success. It had slowly morphed into a physical manifestation of profound betrayal, relentless greed, and absolute toxicity. Every single room held the lingering echo of Dion's unearned arrogance and Megan's vicious manipulation. The polished marble floors and vaulted ceilings were permanently stained by the memory of their criminal entitlement. Selling the restored mansion to a wealthy stranger on the luxury real estate market would yield a massive capital return, but it would also mean passing a deeply cursed structure onto another unsuspecting family. I walked back out to my truck and locked the heavy front doors for the final time. I looked up at the towering columns and the pristine slate roof. I realized that slapping fresh paint over a rotting foundation was a cowardly architectural compromise. I had to decide whether to cash in on the poisoned property or bring in the heavy machinery to completely destroy it and rebuild something pure from the ground up. I convened an emergency meeting with my senior board of directors the following morning. The atmosphere inside the executive conference room was tense and heavily guarded. We reviewed the extensive damage Megan had inflicted upon the corporate estate. The physical repairs to the drywall and the custom fixtures were completely negligible expenses for a commercial architecture firm of our immense size. The true conflict centered entirely around the poisoned public relations narrative attached to the property. The local media had fully uncovered the spectacular collapse of my son and his wife. The sprawling suburban mansion was now notoriously linked to federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. The senior partners presented a comprehensive market analysis detailing the catastrophic devaluation of the asset. Selling the restored property on the competitive luxury real estate market would yield a miserable return. Wealthy prospective buyers actively avoided properties plagued by recent criminal scandals and high-profile police raids. The board members argued aggressively over the balance sheet, suggesting we lease the property to a private diplomat to slowly recoup our financial losses. I sat at the head of the mahogany table and listened to them prioritize immediate profit margins over the long-term integrity of our corporate brand. Leasing the estate meant keeping a physical monument to Dion and Megan's boundless arrogance permanently attached to our company portfolio. I refused to let my empire absorb that toxic stain. I raised my hand, instantly silencing the heated debate across the conference room. I informed the board of directors that we were not going to sell the mansion at a humiliating loss or lease it to a stranger. I announced that the company would willingly absorb the entire financial hit to eradicate the problem permanently. The senior partners stared at me in absolute shock. They demanded to know how I intended to resolve the multi-million-dollar liability without liquidating the physical asset. I stood up from my leather chair and informed them that we were going to tear the entire structure down to the raw dirt. I watched their faces turn pale at the prospect of intentionally destroying a perfectly viable luxury mansion. I did not offer them a democratic vote on the matter. I made a unilateral executive decision. 35 years ago, I secured my very first independent commercial contract to build a small retail plaza downtown. I trusted a cheap supplier to provide the foundation materials. The concrete mix was entirely defective, and the foundation cracked violently before we even framed the first wall. My investors demanded I patch the cracks and proceed to save money. I utterly refused to build my reputation on a compromised foundation. I spent my own meager savings to hire a wrecking crew, cleared the ruined rubble completely, and poured a flawless, stronger base. That uncompromising dedication to structural integrity defined my entire career. Sometimes complete and total demolition is the absolute only path to genuine growth. I applied that exact same brutal logic to the poisoned estate. I told the board that slapping fresh paint over rooms stained by betrayal and criminal greed was a coward's compromise. We were going to erase the physical manifestation of my son's entitlement from the face of the earth. I bypassed external demolition contractors entirely and dispatched my own elite commercial crew to the suburban neighborhood. I stood on the sidewalk the next morning with my 5-year-old grandson holding my hand. We watched together as 2 massive yellow bulldozers rolled past the iron gates and positioned themselves in front of the grand columns of the estate. I gave the foreman a sharp nod. The heavy machinery roared to life, driving their steel blades directly through the pristine brick facade. The walls that once housed my son's unbearable arrogance collapsed into a massive cloud of white dust and splintered wood. The loud, violent destruction of the mansion felt incredibly cathartic, lifting a suffocating weight from my chest with every collapsing beam. By sunset, the luxury estate was reduced to a flat, empty expanse of raw, brown earth. I did not leave the expensive suburban lot barren. I immediately filed an aggressive petition with the city council to rezone the massive residential property for commercial educational use. I utilized my immense political capital to fast-track the permits. I drafted the blueprints myself, staying up late into the night at my drafting table. I designed a state-of-the-art community center and a specialized youth architecture academy. I fully funded the construction through my personal accounts. Entering the facility would provide inner-city teenagers with free access to drafting technology, engineering mentorships, and skilled trade apprenticeships. I transformed a grotesque monument of unearned wealth and criminal entitlement into a permanent beacon of public service. The ground that once nurtured greed would now actively cultivate the next generation of disciplined, hardworking builders. My grandson would grow up watching a foundation of integrity rise from the exact spot where his parents' fraudulent empire had violently fallen. The spectacular demolition of a multi-million-dollar luxury mansion inside an elite suburban gated community generated a massive media frenzy. Local news helicopters circled above the dirt lot, broadcasting the dramatic footage across every major evening television network. The reporters heavily praised my decision to donate the highly valuable land to the community, actively contrasting my philanthropic youth academy with the severe federal indictments currently hanging over my disgraced son. Dayon watched the evening news broadcast from the small mounted television inside his concrete holding cell at the county jail. He sat on his rigid metal cot and stared at the screen as the bulldozers violently crushed the master bedroom where he had slept. He watched the heavy steel treads roll over the exact spot where he had proudly hosted his arrogant charity galas. The absolute finality of the destruction utterly broke whatever fragile delusions he still harbored. He realized that I was not preserving a place for him to return to after he served his prison sentence. I had systematically eradicated every single physical trace of his existence from my empire. He possessed no home, no career, no wife, and no child. Driven by a hollow and overwhelming despair, Dayon approached the corrections officer guarding his cell block. He submitted an urgent formal request through his court-appointed public defender. I knew his federal sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following week, and that he was facing decades behind bars. Dayon requested one final face-to-face visitation with me. He begged for a single hour in the bleak interrogation room to look his father in the eyes before the judge permanently sealed his fate. The final confrontation between a builder and his broken son was now completely inevitable. I stepped through the heavy steel doors of the county detention center. The sterile smell of industrial bleach and stagnant air filled my lungs. The guard escorted me down a long concrete corridor illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. He pointed me toward a cramped visitation booth divided by thick reinforced plexiglass. My son sat on the opposite side. Dayon wore a faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely over his shoulders. The expensive tailored suits and the arrogant posture of a corporate vice president had completely vanished. He looked exhausted, pale, and entirely broken. I sat down on the bolted metal stool and picked up the black plastic telephone receiver. Dayon grabbed his receiver immediately, his hands trembling violently against the scratched plastic. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask about the health or safety of his own son. He launched directly into a desperate, calculated plea for his own survival. His federal sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following morning. He knew the federal prosecutor was pushing for the absolute maximum penalty for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. He begged me to write a formal character reference letter to the presiding judge. He wanted me to stand before the court and officially testify that he was a fundamentally good man who simply made a terrible mistake. He needed the founding architect of the company he robbed to publicly vouch for his integrity. He believed that my prestigious reputation and my status as the primary victim could sway the judge to grant him a significantly reduced sentence. He stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, attempting to weaponize my paternal instincts to save himself from decades in a concrete cell. Dayon pressed his hand against the plexiglass, letting tears stream down his face. He recited a flurry of rehearsed apologies, his voice cracking with artificial remorse. He claimed that he never intended to hurt me or damage the architecture firm I spent my entire life building. He aggressively shifted the entirety of the blame onto his wife. He insisted that Megan had poisoned his mind with her relentless demands for high society luxury and country club prestige. He painted himself as a naive, desperate husband who was bullied into committing grand larceny just to keep his marriage intact. I listened to his theatrical sobbing in absolute silence. I looked into his eyes and saw straight through the performance. I recognized the exact pitch and cadence of his weeping. 54 years ago, when Dion was 16 years old, he stole my personal vehicle in the middle of the night to impress a group of older teenagers. He crashed the car into a brick retaining wall, completely destroying the engine and nearly killing his passengers. When the local police brought him home in handcuffs, he sat at my kitchen table and cried those exact same calculated tears. He blamed the other boys, claiming they forced him to drive and that he was entirely innocent of the reckless choices he made. I paid the massive fines and shielded him from a juvenile detention sentence that night. My leniency taught him that tears could wash away severe criminal consequences. I realized sitting in that jail booth that my refusal to hold a reckless boy accountable had directly forged the corrupt man sitting before me. I refused to repeat the most devastating mistake of my life. I did not raise my voice or offer any cruel remarks. I simply held the plastic receiver and delivered my final, unalterable verdict. I informed Dion that I would not write a single word in his defense. I stated clearly that I would not stand before a federal judge and commit perjury by testifying to a moral character he simply did not possess. I told him I had already submitted my official victim impact statement to the prosecution team. That statement explicitly urged the court to deliver the absolute maximum sentence the federal guidelines allowed. The false tears stopped flowing instantly. His desperate performance shattered entirely, revealing the raw, venomous entitlement boiling underneath the surface. He gripped the phone tight and demanded to know how a father could willingly throw his own flesh and blood to the wolves. I replied that a true father does not shield a corporate thief from the undeniable reality of his own destructive actions. I formally dissolved the bond between us right there in that sterile visitation room. I told him he had traded his family for a cheap illusion of power, and that I no longer recognized the man wearing that orange jumpsuit. I severed his emotional manipulation completely. I released myself from the crushing lifelong guilt of his endless failures. The heavy burden of protecting a criminal vanished from my shoulders forever. I placed the black plastic receiver back onto the metal cradle. I stood up from the stool and turned my back on the visitation booth. Dion erupted into a violent, helpless rage. He slammed his fists repeatedly against the thick, reinforced plexiglass, screaming curses that were completely muffled by the soundproof barrier. Two burly corrections officers immediately rushed into the booth on his side, grabbing his arms and wrestling him forcefully to the concrete floor. I did not look over my shoulder to watch them drag him away to solitary confinement. I walked out of the county detention center, pushed through the heavy steel doors, and stepped into the brisk afternoon air. The architectural empire I built was completely safe. My corporate legacy remained completely untarnished. The hostile threats to my physical property were completely neutralized. Yet as I climbed into the cab of my heavy-duty truck, a new and terrifying reality settled heavily over my mind. The courtroom battles and the boardroom mutinies were entirely logical problems I could solve with contracts and audits. I now faced an emotional crisis that no amount of financial leverage could fix. I turned the ignition key and drove toward my quiet suburban home. My 5-year-old grandson was waiting for me in the living room. The boy had spent the last week playing with his wooden train set, blissfully unaware of the catastrophic collapse of his entire world. I parked in my driveway, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I had to walk through that front door and look an innocent child directly in the eyes. I had to find a way to answer his inevitable, heartbreaking questions about where his parents had gone and why they were never coming back. I parked my heavy-duty truck in the driveway of my quiet suburban home and turned off the ignition. The engine clicked into absolute silence. The confrontation inside the county jail visitation room still echoed in my mind, but I deliberately left the weight of Dion's pathetic manipulation locked inside my truck. I walked up the concrete steps and unlocked my front door. The golden afternoon light filtered through the large bay windows of my living room. My 5-year-old grandson sat on the woven rug, meticulously connecting the magnetic tracks of the vintage wooden train set I had purchased for him on the day this entire nightmare began. He pushed a bright red locomotive across the wooden bridge, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic collapse of his parents' fraudulent empire. He did not know his father was facing decades in a federal penitentiary, or that his mother was currently awaiting her own criminal trial. I took off my jacket and hung it on the brass hook by the door. The massive corporate battles, the frozen bank accounts, and the legal maneuvers were completely irrelevant now. The most terrifying challenge of my entire life was sitting right in front of me on that living room floor. I had to sit down and look an innocent boy directly in his eyes. I had to explain the brutal reality of his parents' sudden disappearance without shattering his fragile spirit or poisoning his young mind with adult resentment. I had protected my legacy and my business from ruthless predators. Now I needed to protect a child's heart from the devastating collateral damage of their greed. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves, and walked slowly toward the center of the room. I lowered myself onto the woven rug and sat cross-legged right beside him. He looked up at me with bright, innocent eyes and handed me a small wooden cargo car to add to his growing train line. I took the small toy and connected it to the tracks, carefully watching his small hands work. My mind drifted back to a harsh winter evening nearly 3 decades ago. A devastating fire had swept through our neighborhood, completely destroying the home of a close family friend. I had struggled with the brutal reality of the loss, pacing the floor with angry frustration. My late wife Yvonne had sat our young son down on this exact same floor. She did not lie to him or offer empty platitudes. She spoke with a profound, quiet grace, explaining the harshness of the world, while wrapping him in an undeniable blanket of absolute safety. She possessed a rare ability to deliver painful truths without instilling fear. I needed her wisdom desperately in this specific moment. I closed my eyes briefly and channeled her steady, calm presence. I promised myself I would not let the bitterness of Dayan's betrayal bleed into my voice. I placed my large, calloused hand gently over my grandson's small fingers, stopping the movement of the wooden train. I looked directly into his eyes, ensuring he felt my complete, undivided attention and my unconditional love. I told him that his mother and father had made some very terrible choices. I explained that adults have rules they must follow just like children do, and when adults break those important rules, they have to face serious consequences. I kept my words simple and direct, avoiding the dark, ugly details of the corporate embezzlement, the forged real estate deeds, and the federal wire fraud indictments. I made sure he understood that his parents would be going away for a very long time to pay for the mistakes they had made. His small brow furrowed in confusion, and his lower lip trembled slightly as he processed the sudden weight of my words. The most crucial part of my explanation had to be absolutely clear. I gripped his small shoulders gently and told him that none of this was his fault. I repeated the phrase 3 times to ensure it anchored deeply in his mind. I promised him that he would never have to worry about his safety, his home, or his future because I was going to be right here with him every single day. The boy stared at the wooden train tracks for a long, quiet moment. Children possess a remarkable, unbroken resilience when they are provided with honest stability. He did not cry or throw a desperate tantrum. He simply processed the profound shift in his reality, nodded his head slowly, and leaned his small weight entirely against my shoulder. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly against my chest. The chaotic storm of deception and greed that had threatened to consume our family was finally over. We sat together on the floor, surrounded by the quiet peace of my home. 6 months later, I stood proudly on the pristine concrete steps of the brand-new Yvonne Vance Youth Architecture Academy. The sprawling state-of-the-art community center now occupied the exact physical footprint where Dion and Megan's fraudulent luxury estate had once stood. I had personally designed the massive steel and glass facility, transforming a grotesque monument of unearned wealth and criminal entitlement into a permanent beacon of public service. Hundreds of community leaders, local politicians, and aspiring young students gathered across the manicured lawn for the official ribbon-cutting ceremony. My grandson stood sharply dressed in a small tailored suit right by my side, gripping my calloused hand tightly. The massive federal investigations were completely resolved. Dion and Megan were securely serving their lengthy sentences in separate federal penitentiaries, completely stripped of their parental rights and their social status. My commercial architecture firm was operating at absolute peak efficiency, securing 3 new massive municipal contracts just last week. The corporate bank accounts were heavily fortified, and the educational trust fund I established for my grandson was entirely untouchable. The toxic elements that had infiltrated my life and threatened to destroy my legacy had been ruthlessly eradicated. I handed my grandson a pair of large ceremonial scissors. We squeezed the heavy brass handles together, cleanly severing the bright red ribbon draped across the entrance doors. The crowd erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. I looked out over the smiling faces of the community I had spent my entire life building. I felt the warm morning sun radiating against my face. The concrete foundation beneath my boots was flawless and unbreakable. I had finally achieved absolute unbroken peace. I sit on the back porch of my quiet suburban home and watch the autumn leaves fall across the manicured lawn. My grandson is kneeling in the dirt near the edge of the garden, using a small plastic trowel to dig a trench for his wooden train set. His hands are covered in dark soil, and his face is smeared with mud. I watch him work with a profound sense of peace. He is learning the exact lesson his father fundamentally failed to understand. The most critical lesson I took away from the absolute destruction of my own family is that unearned luxury is a slow and silent poison. When you spend your entire life removing every single obstacle from a child's path, you do not pave a road to their success. You pave a high-speed highway directly to their moral bankruptcy. I spent 40 years inhaling concrete dust and fighting brutal corporate wars because I wanted to ensure my bloodline never knew the bitter taste of generational poverty. I gave my son a title he never earned, a mansion he never bought, and a safety net he never respected. I believed my financial generosity was an expression of deep paternal love. I was catastrophically wrong. My relentless desire to shield him from the harsh consequences of his own poor decisions actively transformed him into a desperate, entitled predator. I built a massive, impenetrable fortress of wealth, but I completely neglected to build his character. True wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the balance of a corporate trust fund or a massive luxury estate. True wealth is the unshakable integrity you carry in your bones. It is the ability to look at yourself in the mirror every single morning and know that you did not compromise your morals for convenience. My son and his wife possessed millions of dollars in corporate credit, yet they were the poorest, most miserable people I have ever encountered. They were drowning in a suffocating ocean of social expectations, constantly terrified that their high society friends would discover they were massive frauds. They chased a hollow, meaningless image of perfection while actively destroying the very foundation that sustained them. They believed family was simply an automated teller machine bound by blood. I learned the hard way that blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. True family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and a shared commitment to honesty. The moment someone attempts to weaponize your love to fund their arrogance, they forfeit their right to sit at your table. Setting boundaries with toxic family members is the most agonizing process a human being can endure. Society conditions us to forgive our relatives, endlessly demanding we endure relentless disrespect simply because we share a last name. That societal expectation is a dangerous and toxic lie. Walking away from my own son was the hardest decision I ever made, but it was also the most necessary. If I had yielded to his emotional extortion, if I had paid the shadow financier to save his reputation, I would have signed the death warrant for my own soul. I would have validated his criminal entitlement and allowed a monster to raise my innocent grandson. Cutting the financial cord did not actually destroy my family. The family was already dead the moment they decided my dignity was an acceptable price for their luxury. My ruthless intervention simply cleared the wreckage so something entirely new and pure could finally grow from the bare earth. Today, my commercial architecture firm operates with greater efficiency and purpose than ever before. The Youth Academy, standing over the ruins of their stolen mansion, currently mentors 200 inner-city teenagers, teaching them the value of structural engineering and honest, calloused hands. My grandson is thriving in an environment defined by rigid discipline and boundless unconditional love. He knows that every single toy he owns and every privilege he enjoys must be earned through good behavior and respect. He will never receive a corporate credit card he did not sweat for. He will inherit my empire only when he proves he possesses the moral fortitude to carry its massive weight. I sit in my office now looking out over the city skyline, entirely unburdened by the ghosts of their greed. My health remains robust, my mind remains sharp, and my conscience is permanently clear. I no longer live in fear of ringing telephones or arrogant demands. The absolute peace they mockingly demanded from me is now the defining characteristic of my daily existence. I successfully reclaimed my territory, my hard-earned assets, and my profound self-respect. If you are watching this and finding yourself trapped in a relentless cycle of family abuse, I need you to hear my words very clearly. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire simply to keep your ungrateful relatives warm. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, your finances, and your dignity. Walking away from toxic bloodlines does not make you a cruel person. It makes you a survivor. Never allow anyone to mistake your quiet patience for foolish weakness. Draw your line in the concrete and refuse to move. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my deeply personal journey today. I want to know how far this message of reclaiming dignity has traveled. Please let me know in the comments section below exactly which city and state you are watching this video from. If my story resonated with your own struggles, or If you have ever had to stand up to a family member who severely underestimated your worth, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Sharing these experiences helps us all realize that we are never alone in our fight for basic respect. I look forward to reading your comments and connecting with every single one of you. Stay strong, protect your peace, always value your own self-worth, and I will see you in the next